Section 1 of Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Youth, by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by C.J. Hogarth. Section 1. Chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 1. What I consider to have been the beginning of my youth. I have said that my friendship with Dimitri opened up for me a new view of my life and of its aim and relations. The essence of that view lay in the conviction that the destiny of man is to strive for moral improvement, and that such improvement is at once easy, possible, and lasting. Hitherto, however, I had found pleasure only in the new ideas which I discovered to arise from that conviction, and in the forming of brilliant plans for a moral, active future, while all the time my life had been continuing along its old, petty, muddled, pleasure-seeking course, and the same virtuous thoughts which I and my adored friend Dimitri, my own marvellous Mischa, as I used to call him to myself in a whisper, had been wont to exchange with one another, still pleased my intellect, but left my sensibility untouched. Nevertheless, there came a moment when those thoughts swept into my head with a sudden freshness and force of moral revelation, which left me aghast at the amount of time which I had been wasting, and made me feel as though I must at once, that very second, apply those thoughts to life, with the firm intention of never again changing them. It is from that moment that I date the beginning of my youth. I was then nearly 16. Tutors still attended to give me lessons. St. Jerome still acted as general supervisor of my education, and, willy-nilly, I was being prepared for the university. In addition to my studies, my occupations included certain vague dreamings and ponderings, a number of gymnastic exercises to make myself the finest athlete in the world, a good deal of aimless, thoughtless wandering through the rooms of the house, but more especially along the maidservants' quarter, and much looking at myself in the mirror. From the latter, however, I always turned away with a vague feeling of depression, almost of repulsion. Not only did I feel sure that my exterior was ugly, but I could derive no comfort from any of the usual consolations under such circumstances. I could not say, for instance, that I had at least an expressive, clever, or refined face, for there was nothing whatever expressive about it. Its features were of the most humdrum, dull, and unbecoming type, with small grey eyes which seemed to me, whenever I regarded them in the mirror, to be stupid rather than clever. Of manly bearing I possessed even less, since, although I was not exactly small of stature, and had moreover plenty of strength for my years, every feature in my face was of the meek, sleepy-looking, indefinite type. Even refinement was lacking in it, since, on the contrary, it precisely resembled that of a simple-looking moujik, while I also had the same big hands and feet as he. At the time, all this seemed to me very shameful. Chapter 2. Springtime. Easter of the year when I entered the university fell late in April, so that the examinations were fixed for St. Thomas's week, Easter week, and I had to spend Good Friday in fasting and finally getting myself ready for the ordeal. Following upon wet snow, the kind of stuff which Karl Ivanitch used to describe as a child following its father, the weather had for 3 days been bright and mild and still. Not a clot of snow was now to be seen in the streets, and the dirty slush had given place to wet, shining pavements and coursing rivulets. The last icicles on the roofs were fast melting in the sunshine, buds were swelling on the trees in the little garden, the path leading across the courtyard to the stables was soft instead of being a frozen ridge of mud, and mossy grass was showing green between the stones around the entrance steps. It was just that particular time in spring when the season exercises the strongest influence upon the human soul, when clear sunlight illuminates everything, yet sheds no warmth, when rivulets run trickling under one's feet, when the air is charged with an odorous freshness, and when the bright blue sky is streaked with long, transparent clouds. For some reason or another, the influence of this early stage in the birth of spring always seems to me more perceptible and more impressive in a great town than in the country. One sees less, but one feels more. I was standing near the window, through the double frames of which the morning sun was throwing its mote-flecked beams upon the floor of what seemed to me my intolerably wearisome schoolroom, and working out a long algebraical equation on the blackboard. In one hand I was holding a ragged, long-suffering algebra, and in the other a small piece of chalk which had already besmeared my hands, my face, and the elbows of my jacket. Nicola, clad in an apron, and with his sleeves rolled up, was picking out the putty from the window-frames with a pair of nippers, and unfastening the screws. The window looked out upon the little garden. At length this occupation and the noise which he was making over it arrested my attention. At the moment I was in a very cross, dissatisfied frame of mind, for nothing seemed to be going right with me. I had made a mistake at the very beginning of my algebra, and so should have to work it out again. Twice I had let the chalk drop. I was conscious that my hands and face were whitened all over. The sponge had rolled away into a corner, and the noise of Nicola's operations was fast getting on my nerves. I had a feeling as though I wanted to fly into a temper and grumble at some one, so I threw down chalk and algebra alike, and began to pace the room. Then suddenly I remembered that to-day we were to go to confession, and that therefore I must refrain from doing anything wrong. Next, with equal suddenness, I relapsed into an extraordinarily good-humoured frame of mind, and walked across to Nicola. "Let me help you, Nicola," I said, trying to speak as pleasantly as I possibly could. The idea that I was performing a meritorious action in thus suppressing my ill temper and offering to help him increased my good humour all the more. By this time the putty had been chipped out and the screws removed, yet, though Nicola pulled with might and main at the cross-piece, the window-frame refused to budge. "If it comes out as soon as he and I begin to pull it together," I thought, "it will be rather a shame, as then I shall have nothing more of the kind to do to-day." Suddenly the frame yielded a little at one side, and came out. "Where shall I put it?" I said. "Let me see to it, if you please," replied Nicola, evidently surprised as well as seemingly not over-pleased at my zeal. "We must not leave it here, but carry it away to the lumber-room, where I keep all the frames stored and numbered." "Oh, but I can manage it," I said as I lifted it up. I verily believe that if the lumber-room had been a couple of versts away, and the frame twice as heavy as it was, I should have been the more pleased. I felt as though I wanted to tire myself out in performing this service for Nicola. When I returned to the room, the bricks and screws had been replaced on the window-sill, and Nicola was sweeping the debris, as well as a few torpid flies, out of the open window. The fresh, fragrant air was rushing into and filling all the room, while with it came also the dull murmur of the city and the twittering of sparrows in the garden. Everything was brilliant light. The room looked cheerful, and a gentle spring breeze was stirring Nicola's hair and the leaves of my algebra. Approaching the window, I sat down upon the sill, turned my eyes downwards toward the garden, and fell into a brown study. Something new to me, something extraordinarily potent and unfamiliar, had suddenly invaded my soul. The wet ground on which, here and there, a few yellowish stalks and blades of bright green grass were to be seen, the little rivulets glittering in the sunshine, and sweeping clouds of earth and tiny chips of wood along with them, the reddish twigs of the lilac with their swelling buds, which nodded just beneath the window, the fussy twitterings of birds as they fluttered in the bush below, the blackened fence shining wet from the snow which had lately melted off it, and, most of all, the raw, odorous air and radiant sunlight, all spoke to me, clearly and unmistakably, of something new and beautiful, of something which, though I cannot repeat it here as it was then expressed to me, I will try to reproduce so far as I understood it. Everything spoke to me of beauty, happiness, and virtue, as three things which were both easy and possible for me, and said that no one of them could exist without the other two, since beauty, happiness, and virtue were one. "How did I never come to understand that before?" I cried to myself. "How did I ever manage to be so wicked? Oh, but how good, how happy I could be, nay, I will be, in the future! At once, yes, this very minute, I will become another being, and begin to live differently. For all that, I continued sitting on the window-sill, continued merely dreaming and doing nothing. Have you ever, on a summer's day, gone to bed in dull, rainy weather, and waking just at sunset, opened your eyes and seen through the square space of the window, the space where the linen blind is blowing up and down, and beating its rod upon the window-sill, the rain-soaked, shadowy, purple vista of an avenue of lime trees, with a damp garden path lit up by the clear, slanting beams of the sun, and then suddenly heard the joyous sounds of bird-life in the garden, and seen insects flying to and fro at the open window, and glittering in the sunlight, and smelt the fragrance of the rain-washed air, and thought to yourself, "Am I not ashamed to be lying in bed on such an evening as this?" and leaping joyously to your feet, gone out into the garden and revelled in all that welter of life? If you have, then you can imagine for yourself the overpowering sensation which was then possessing me. Chapter 3. Dreams. "Today I will make my confession and purge myself of every sin," I thought to myself, "nor will I ever commit another one." At this point I recalled all the peccadilloes which most troubled my conscience. I will go to church regularly every Sunday, as well as read the Gospel at the close of every hour throughout the day. What is more, I will set aside, out of the cheque which I shall receive each month after I have gone to the University, 2½ roubles, a tenth of my monthly allowance, for people who are poor but not exactly beggars, yet without letting any one know anything about it. Yes, I will begin to look out for people like that, orphans or old women, at once, yet never tell a soul what I am doing for them. Also, I will have a room here of my very own, St. Jerome's probably, and look after it myself, and keep it perfectly clean. I will never let any one do anything for me, for every one is just a human being like myself. Likewise, I will walk every day, not drive, to the University. Even if some one gives me a droshky (Russian phaeton), I will sell it, and devote money to the poor. Everything I will do exactly and always. What that always meant I could not possibly have said, but at least I had a vivid consciousness of its connoting some kind of prudent, moral, and irreproachable life. I will get up all my lectures thoroughly, and go over all the subjects beforehand, so that at the end of my first course I may come out on top and write a thesis. During my second course also I will get up everything beforehand, so that I may soon be transferred to the third course, and at 18 come out on top in the examinations, and receive 2 gold medals, and go on to be Master of Arts, and Doctor, and the first scholar in Europe. Yes, in all Europe I mean to be the first scholar. Well, what next? I asked myself at this point. Suddenly it struck me that dreams of this sort were a form of pride, a sin which I should have to confess to the priest that very evening, so I returned to the original thread of my meditations. When getting up my lectures I will go to the Vorobievi Gori (Sparrow Hills, a public park near Moscow), and choose some spot under a tree and read my lectures over there. Sometimes I will take with me something to eat, cheese or a pie from Pedotti's, or something of the kind. After that I will sleep a little, and then read some good book or other, or else draw pictures, or play on some instrument. Certainly I must learn to play the flute. Perhaps she, too, will be walking on the Vorobievi Gori, and will approach me one day and say, "Who are you?" And I shall look at her, oh so sadly, and say that I am the son of a priest, and that I am happy only when I am there alone, quite alone. Then she will give me her hand, and say something to me, and sit down beside me. So every day we shall go to the same spot, and be friends together, and I shall kiss her. But no! That would not be right. On the contrary, from this day forward I never mean to look at a woman again. Never, never again do I mean to walk with a girl, nor even to go near one if I can help it. Yet, of course, in 3 years' time, when I have come of age, I shall marry. Also, I mean to take as much exercise as ever I can, and to do gymnastics every day, so that when I have turned 25 I shall be stronger even than Rappo. On my first day's training I mean to hold out half a pud. The pud equals 40 Russian pounds. At arm's length for 5 minutes, and the next day 21 pounds, and the third day 22 pounds, and so on, until at last I can hold out 4 poods in each hand, and be stronger even than a porter. Then if ever any one should try to insult me, or should begin to speak disrespectfully of her, I shall take him so by the front of his coat, and lift him up an arshin (the arshin equals 2 feet 3 inches), or 2 with one hand, and just hold him there, so that he may feel my strength and cease from his conduct. Yet that too would not be right. No, no, it would not matter. I should not hurt him, merely show him that Let no one blame me because the dreams of my youth were as foolish as those of my childhood and boyhood. I am sure that, even if it be my fate to live to extreme old age and to continue my story with the years, I, an old man of 70, shall be found dreaming dreams just as impossible and childish as those I am dreaming now. I shall be dreaming of some lovely Maria who loves me, the toothless old man, as she might love a Mazeppa; of some imbecile son who, through some extraordinary chance, has suddenly become a minister of state; of my suddenly receiving a windfall of 1,000,000 roubles. I am sure that there exists no human being, no human age, to whom or to which that gracious consolatory power of dreaming is totally a stranger. Yet, save for the one general feature of magic and impossibility, the dreams of each human being, of each age of man, have their own distinguishing characteristics. At the period upon which I look as having marked the close of my boyhood and the beginning of my youth, 4 leading sentiments formed the basis of my dreams. The first of those sentiments was love for her, for an imaginary woman whom I always pictured the same in my dreams, and whom I somehow expected to meet some day and somewhere. This she of mine had a little of Sonetchka in her, a little of Masha, as Masha could look when she stood washing linen over the clothes-tub, and a little of a certain woman with pearls round her fair white neck, whom I had once seen long, long ago at a theatre, in a box below our own. My second sentiment was a craving for love. I wanted every one to know me and to love me. I wanted to be able to utter my name, Nicola Irtenieff, and at once to see every one thunderstruck at it, and come crowding round me and thanking me for something or another, I hardly knew what. My third sentiment was the expectation of some extraordinary, glorious happiness that was impending, some happiness so strong and assured as to verge upon ecstasy. Indeed, so firmly persuaded was I that very, very soon some unexpected chance would suddenly make me the richest and most famous man in the world, that I lived in constant, tremulous expectation of this magic good fortune befalling me. I was always thinking to myself that it is a beginning, and that I should go on thereafter to attain everything that a man could wish for. Consequently, I was ever hurrying from place to place, in the belief that it must be beginning just where I happened not to be. Lastly, my fourth and principal sentiment of all was abhorrence of myself, mingled with regret, yet a regret so blended with the certain expectation of happiness to which I have referred that it had nothing of sorrow. It seemed to me that it would be so easy and natural for me to tear myself away from my past and to remake it, to forget all that had been, and to begin my life, with all its relations, anew, that the past never troubled me, never clung to me at all. I even found a certain pleasure in detesting the past, and in seeing it in a darker light than the true one. This note of regret and of a curious longing for perfection were the chief mental impressions which I gathered from that new stage of my growth, impressions which imparted new principles to my view of myself, of men, and of God's world. O good and consoling voice, which in later days, in sorrowful days when my soul yielded silently to the sway of life's falseness and depravity, so often raised a sudden, bold protest against all iniquity, as well as mercilessly exposed the past, commanded, nay, compelled me to love only the pure vista of the present, and promised me all that was fair and happy in the future. O good and consoling voice, surely the day will never come when you are silent. Chapter 4. Our Family Circle. Papa was seldom at home that spring, yet whenever he was so, he seemed extraordinarily cheerful as he either strummed his favourite pieces on the piano, or looked roguishly at us and made jokes about us all, not excluding even Mimi. For instance, he would say that the Tsarevitch himself had seen Mimi at the rink, and fallen so much in love with her that he had presented a petition to the Synod for divorce, or else that I had been granted an appointment as secretary to the Austrian ambassador, a piece of news which he imparted to us with a perfectly grave face. Next he would frighten Katenka with some spiders, of which she was very much afraid, engage in an animated conversation with our friends Dubkoff and Nechludoff, and tell us and our guests over and over again his plans for the year. Although these plans changed almost from day to day, and were forever contradicting one another, they seemed so attractive that we were always glad to listen to them, and Lubotshka, in particular, would glue her eyes to his face so as not to lose a single word. One day his plan would be that he should leave my brother and myself at the University, and go and live with Lubotshka in Italy for 2 years. Next, the plan would be that he should buy an estate in the south coast of the Crimea, and take us for an annual visit there. Next, that we should migrate en masse to St. Petersburg, and so forth. Yet, in addition to this unusual cheerfulness of his, another change had come over him of late, a change which greatly surprised me. This was that he had had some fashionable clothes made, an olive-coloured frock-coat, smart trousers with straps at the sides, and a long wadded greatcoat which fitted him to perfection. Often, too, there was a delightful smell of scent about him when he came home from a party, more especially when he had been to see a lady of whom Mimi never spoke, but with a sigh and a face that seemed to say, "Poor orphans, how dreadful! It is a good thing that she is gone now," and so on, and so on. From Nicola, for Papa never spoke to us of his gambling, I had learnt that he, Papa, had been very fortunate in play that winter, and so had won an extraordinary amount of money, all of which he had placed in the bank after vowing that he would play no more that spring. Evidently it was his fear of being unable to resist again doing so that was rendering him anxious to leave for the country as soon as possible. Indeed, he ended by deciding not to wait until I had entered the University, but to take the girls to Petrovskoe immediately after Easter, and to leave Woloda and myself to follow them at a later season. All that winter, until the opening of spring, Woloda had been inseparable from Dubkoff, while at the same time the pair of them had cooled greatly towards Dimitri. Their chief amusements, so I gathered from conversations overheard, were continual drinking of champagne, sledge-driving past the windows of a lady with whom both of them appeared to be in love, and dancing with her. Not at children's parties either, but at real balls. It was this last fact which, despite our love for one another, placed a vast gulf between Woloda and myself. We felt that the distance between a boy still taking lessons under a tutor and a man who danced at real grown-up balls was too great to allow of their exchanging mutual ideas. Katenka, too, seemed grown up now, and read innumerable novels, so that the idea that she would some day be getting married no longer seemed to me a joke. Yet, though she and Woloda were thus grown up, they never made friends with one another, but, on the contrary, seemed to cherish a mutual contempt. In general, when Katenka was at home alone, nothing but novels amused her, and they but slightly. But as soon as ever a visitor of the opposite sex called, she at once grew lively and amiable, and used her eyes for saying things which I could not then understand. It was only later, when she one day informed me in conversation that the only thing a girl was allowed to indulge in was coquetry of the eyes, I mean, that I understood those strange contortions of her features which to every one else had seemed a matter for no surprise at all. Lubotshka also had begun to wear what was almost a long dress, a dress which almost concealed her goose-shaped feet. Yet she still remained as ready a weeper as ever. She dreamed now of marrying, not a hussar, but a singer or an instrumentalist, and accordingly applied herself to her music with greater diligence than ever. St. Jerome, who knew that he was going to remain with us only until my examinations were over, and so had obtained for himself a new post in the family of some count or another, now looked with contempt upon the members of our household. He stayed indoors very little, took to smoking cigarettes, then all the rage, and was forever whistling lively tunes on the edge of a card. Mimi daily grew more and more despondent, as though Now that we were beginning to grow up, she looked for nothing good from any one or anything. When, on the day of which I am speaking, I went in to luncheon, I found only Mimi, Katenka, Lubotshka, and St. Jerome in the dining-room. Papa was away, and Woloda in his own room doing some preparation work for his examinations in company with a party of his comrades, wherefore he had requested that lunch should be sent to him there. Of late, Mimi had usually taken the head of the table, and as none of us had any respect for her, luncheon had lost most of its refinement and charm. That is to say, the meal was no longer what it had been in Mamma's or our grandmother's time, namely, a kind of rite which brought all the family together at a given hour and divided the day into two halves. We allowed ourselves to come in as late as the second course, to drink wine in tumblers (St. Jerome himself set us the example), to roll about on our chairs, to depart without saying grace, and so on. In fact, luncheon had ceased to be a family ceremony. In the old days, at Petrovskoe, every one had been used to wash and dress for the meal, and then to repair to the drawing-room, as the appointed hour, 2 o'clock, drew near, and pass the time of waiting in lively conversation. Just as the clock in the servants' hall was beginning to whir before striking the hour, Foka would enter with noiseless footsteps, and, throwing his napkin over his arm, and assuming a dignified, rather severe expression, would say in loud, measured tones, "Luncheon is ready." Thereupon, with pleased, cheerful faces, we would form a procession, the elders going first and the juniors following, and with much rustling of starched petticoats and subdued creaking of boots and shoes, would proceed to the dining-room, where, still talking in undertones, the company would seat themselves in their accustomed places. Or again, at Moscow, we would all of us be standing before the table ready laid in the hall, talking quietly among ourselves, as we waited for our grandmother, whom the butler, Gabriel, had gone to acquaint with the fact that luncheon was ready. Suddenly, the door would open, there would come the faint swish of a dress and the sound of footsteps, and our grandmother, dressed in a mob-cap trimmed with a quaint old lilac bow, and wearing either a smile or a severe expression on her face according as the state of her health inclined her, would issue from her room. Gabriel would hasten to precede her to her armchair, the other chairs would make a scraping sound, and with a feeling as though a cold shiver, the precursor of appetite, were running down one's back, one would seize upon one's damp, starched napkin, nibble a morsel or two of bread, and, rubbing one's hands softly under the table, gaze with eager, radiant impatience at the steaming plates of soup which the butler was beginning to dispense in order of ranks and ages, or according to the favour of our grandmother. On the present occasion, however, I was conscious of neither excitement nor pleasure when I went in to luncheon. Even the mingled chatter of Mimi, the girls, and St. Jerome about the horrible boots of our Russian tutor, the pleated dresses worn by the young Princesses Kornakoff, and so forth, chatter which at any other time would have filled me with sincerity of contempt which I should have been at no pains to conceal, at all events so far as Lubotshka and Katenka were concerned, failed to shake the benevolent frame of mind into which I had fallen. I was unusually good-humoured that day, and listened to everything with a smile and a studied air of kindness. Even when I asked for the kvass, I did so politely, while I lost not a moment in agreeing with St. Jerome when he told me that it was undoubtedly more correct to say "je peux" than "je puis." Yet I must confess to a certain disappointment at finding that no one paid any particular attention to my politeness and good-humour. After luncheon, Lubotshka showed me a paper on which she had written down a list of her sins, upon which I observed that, although the idea was excellent so far as it went, it would be still better for her to write down her sins on her soul, a very different matter. "Why is it a very different matter?" asked Lubotshka. "Never mind. That is all right. You do not understand me." And I went upstairs to my room, telling St. Jerome that I was going to work, but in reality purposing to occupy the hour and a half before confession time in writing down a list of my daily tasks and duties which should last me all my life, together with a statement of my life's aim, and the rules by which I meant unswervingly to be guided. End of Section 1. Recording by Bill Borst. Section 2. of Youth, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by C.J. Hogarth. This recording is in the public domain. Section 2, Chapters 5 through 8. Chapter 5. My Rules. I took some sheets of paper, and tried first of all to make a list of my tasks and duties for the coming year. The paper needed ruling, but as I could not find the ruler, I had to use a Latin dictionary instead. The result was that, when I had drawn the pen along the edge of the dictionary and removed the latter, I found that in place of a line I had only made an oblong smudge on the paper, since the dictionary was not long enough to reach across it, and the pen had slipped round the soft, yielding corner of the book. Thereupon I took another piece of paper, and by carefully manipulating the dictionary contrived to rule what at least resembled lines, dividing my duties into 3 sections: my duties to myself, my duties to my neighbor, and my duties to God. I started to indite a list of the first of those sections, but they seemed to me so numerous, and therefore requiring to be divided into so many species and subdivisions, that I thought I had better first of all write down the heading of Rules of my Life before proceeding to their detailed description. Accordingly, I proceeded to write Rules of my Life on the outside of the 6 sheets of paper which I had made into a sort of folio, but the words came out in such a crooked and uneven scrawl that for long I sat debating the question, shall I write them again? For long sat in agonized contemplation of the ragged handwriting and disfigured title-page. Why was it that all the beauty and clarity which my soul then contained came out so misshapenly on paper, as in life itself, just when I was wishing to apply those qualities to what I was thinking at the moment? "The priest is here, so please come downstairs and hear his directions," said Nicola as he entered. Hurriedly concealing my folio under the tablecloth, I looked at myself in the mirror, combed my hair upwards (I imagined this to give me a pensive air), and descended to the divannaia (room with divans or anteroom), where the table stood covered with a cloth and had an ikon and candles placed upon it. Papa entered just as I did, but by another door, whereupon the priest, a grey-headed old monk with a severe elderly face, blessed him, and Papa kissed his small, squat, wizened hand. I did the same. "Go and call Waldemar," said Papa. "Where is he? Wait a minute, though. Perhaps he is preparing for the communion at the University?" "No, he is with the Prince," said Katenka, and glanced at Lubotshka. Suddenly the latter blushed for some reason or another, and then frowned. Finally, pretending that she was not well, she left the room, and I followed her. In the drawing-room she halted and began to pencil something fresh on her paper of peccadilloes. "Well, what new sin have you gone and committed?" I asked. "Nothing," she replied with another blush. All at once we heard Dimitri's voice raised in the hall as he took his leave of Woloda. "It seems to me you are always experiencing some new temptation," said Katenka, who had entered the room behind us, and now stood looking at Lubotshka. What was the matter with my sister I could not conceive, but she was now so agitated that the tears were starting from her eyes. Finally her confusion grew uncontrollable, and vented itself in rage against both herself and Katenka, who appeared to be teasing her. "Any one can see that you are a foreigner," she cried. Nothing offended Katenka so much as to be called by that term, which is why Lubotshka used it. "Just because I have the secret of which you know," she went on, with anger ringing through her tone, "you purposely go and upset me. Please do understand that it is no joking matter." "Do you know what she has gone and written on her paper, Nicolinka?" cried Katenka, much infuriated by the term foreigner. "She has written down that—" "Oh, I never could have believed that you could be so cruel!" exclaimed Lubotshka, now bursting into open sobbing as she moved away from us. "You chose that moment on purpose. You spend your whole time in trying to make me sin. I'll never go to you again for sympathy and advice." Chapter 6. Confession. With these and other disjointed impressions in my mind, I returned to the divannaia. As soon as every one had reassembled, the priest rose and prepared to read the prayer before confession. The instant that the silence was broken by the stern, expressive voice of the monk as he recited the prayer, and more especially when he addressed to us the words, "Reveal thou all thy sins without shame, concealment, or extenuation, and let thy soul be cleansed before God. For if thou concealest aught, then great will be thy sin." The same sensation of reverent awe came over me as I had felt during the morning. I even took a certain pleasure in recognizing this condition of mine, and strove to preserve it, not only by restraining all other thoughts from entering my brain, but also by consciously exerting myself to feel no other sensation than this same one of reverence. Papa was the first to go to confession. He remained a long, long time in the room which had belonged to our grandmother, and during that time the rest of us kept silence in the divannaia, or whispered to one another on the subject of who should precede whom. At length the voice of the priest again reading the prayer sounded from the doorway, and then Papa's footsteps. The door creaked as he came out, coughing and holding one shoulder higher than the other, in his usual way, and for the moment he did not look at any of us. "You go now, Luba," he said presently, as he gave her cheek a mischievous pinch. "Mind you tell him everything. You are my greatest sinner, you know." Lubotshka went red and pale by turns, took her memorandum paper out of her apron, replaced it, and finally moved away towards the doorway, with her head sunk between her shoulders, as though she expected to receive a blow upon it from above. She was not gone long, and when she returned her shoulders were shaking with sobs. At length, next after the excellent Katenka, who came out of the doorway with a smile on her face, my turn arrived. I entered the dimly lighted room with the same vague feeling of awe, the same conscious eagerness to arouse that feeling more and more in my soul that had possessed me up to the present moment. The priest, standing in front of a reading desk, slowly turned his face to me. I was not more than 5 minutes in the room, but came out from it happy, and so I persuaded myself, entirely cleansed, a new, a morally reborn individual. Despite the fact that the old surroundings of my life now struck me as unfamiliar, even though the rooms, the furniture, and my own figure—would to heavens that I could have changed my outer man for the better in the same way that I believed myself to have changed my inner I—were the same as before, I remained in that comfortable attitude of mine until the very moment of bedtime. Yet no sooner had I begun to grow drowsy with the conning over of my sins than in a flash I recollected a particularly shameful sin which I had suppressed at confession time. Instantly the words of the prayer before confession came back to my memory and began sounding in my ears. My peace was gone for ever. "For if thou concealest aught, then great will be thy sin." Each time that the phrase recurred to me I saw myself a sinner for whom no punishment was adequate. Long did I toss from side to side as I considered my position, while expecting every moment to be visited with the divine wrath, to be struck with sudden death perhaps, an insupportable thought. Then suddenly the reassuring thought occurred to me: why should I not drive out to the monastery when the morning comes, and see the priest again, and make a second confession? Thereafter I grew calmer. Chapter 7. The Expedition to the Monastery. Several times that night I woke in terror at the thought that I might be oversleeping myself, and by 6 o'clock was out of bed, although the dawn was hardly peeping in at the window. I put on my clothes and boots, all of which were lying tumbled and unbrushed beside the bed, since Nicola, of course, had not been in yet to tidy them up, and without a prayer said or my face washed, emerged, for the first time in my life, into the street alone. Over the way, behind the green roof of a large building, the dim, cold dawn was beginning to blush red. The keen frost of the spring morning, which had stiffened the pools and mud and made them crackle under my feet, now nipped my face and hands also. Not a cab was to be seen, though I had counted upon one to make the journey out and home the quicker. Only a file of wagons was rumbling along the Arbet Prospect, and a couple of bricklayers talking noisily together as they strode along the pavement. However, after walking a verst or so, I began to meet men and women taking baskets to market or going with empty barrels to fetch the day's water supply, until at length, at the cross-streets near the Arbot gate, where a pieman had set up his stall and a baker was just opening his shop, I espied an old cabman, shaking himself after indulging in a nap on the box of his bescratched old blue-painted hobbledehoy wreck of a drozhki. He seemed barely awake as he asked 20 kopecks as the fare to the monastery and back, but came to himself a moment afterwards, just as I was about to get in, and, touching up his horse with the spare end of the reins, started to drive off and leave me. "My horse wants feeding," he growled. "I can't take you, Barin, sir." With some difficulty, and a promise of 40 kopecks, I persuaded him to stop. He eyed me narrowly as he pulled up, but nevertheless said, "Very well, get in, Barin." I must confess that I had some qualms lest he should drive me to a quiet corner somewhere, and then rob me, but I caught hold of the collar of his ragged driving-coat, close to where his wrinkled neck showed sadly lean above his hunched-up back, and climbed on to the blue-painted, curved, rickety seat. As we set off along Vozdvizhenka Street, I noticed that the back of the drozhki was covered with a strip of the same greenish material as that of which his coat was made. For some reason or another this reassured me, and I no longer felt nervous of being taken to a quiet spot and robbed. The sun had risen to a good height, and was gilding the cupolas of the churches when we arrived at the monastery. In the shade the frost had not yet given, but in the open roadway muddy rivulets of water were coursing along, and it was through fast-thawing mire that the horse went clip-clopping his way. Alighting, and entering the monastery grounds, I inquired of the first monk whom I met where I could find the priest whom I was seeking. "His cell is over there," replied the monk as he stopped a moment and pointed towards a little building up to which a flight of steps led. "I respectfully thank you," I said, and then fell to wondering what all the monks, who at that moment began to come filing out of the church, must be thinking of me as they glanced in my direction. I was neither a grown-up nor a child. While my face was unwashed, my hair unbrushed, my clothes tumbled, and my boots unblacked and muddy. To what class of persons were the brethren assigning me? For they stared at me hard enough. Nevertheless, I proceeded in the direction which the young priest had pointed out to me. An old man with bushy grey eyebrows and a black cassock met me on the narrow path to the cells, and asked me what I wanted. For a brief moment I felt inclined to say nothing, and then run back to the drozhki and drive away home. But, for all its beetling brows, the face of the old man inspired confidence, and I merely said that I wished to see the priest, whom I named. "Very well, young sir, I will take you to him," said the old man as he turned round. Clearly, he had guessed my errand at a stroke. "The father is at matins at this moment, but he will soon be back," and, opening a door, the old man led me through a neat hall and corridor, all lined with clean matting, to a cell. "Please to wait here," he added, and then, with a kind, reassuring glance, departed. The little room in which I found myself was of the smallest possible dimensions, but extremely neat and clean. Its furniture only consisted of a small table covered with a cloth and placed between two equally small casement windows, in which stood 2 pots of geraniums, a stand of ikons with a lamp suspended in front of them, a bench, and 2 chairs. In one corner hung a wall clock, with little flowers painted on its dial, and brass weights to its chains, while upon 2 nails driven into a screen, which, fastened to the ceiling with whitewashed pegs, probably concealed the bed, hung a couple of cassocks. The windows looked out upon a whitewashed wall, about 2 arshins distant, and in the space between them there grew a small lilac bush. Not a sound penetrated from without, and in the stillness the measured, friendly stroke of the clock's pendulum seemed to beat quite loudly. The instant that I found myself alone in this calm retreat, all other thoughts and recollections left my head as completely as though they had never been there, and I subsided into an inexpressibly pleasing kind of torpor. The rusty alpaca cassocks with their frayed linings, the worn black leather bindings of the books with their metal clasps, the dull green plants with their carefully watered leaves and soil, and, above all, the abrupt, regular beat of the pendulum, all spoke to me intimately of some new life hitherto unknown to me, a life of unity and prayer, of calm, restful happiness. The months, the years may pass, I thought to myself, but he remains alone, always at peace, always knowing that his conscience is pure before God, that his prayer will be heard by him. For fully half an hour I sat on that chair, trying not to move, not even to breathe loudly, for fear I should mar the harmony of the sounds which were telling me so much, and ever the pendulum continued to beat the same, now a little louder to the right, now a little softer to the left. Chapter 8. The Second Confession. Suddenly, The sound of the priest's footsteps roused me from this reverie. "Good morning to you," he said as he smoothed his grey hair with his hand. "What can I do for you?" I besought him to give me his blessing, and then kissed his small, wizened hand with great fervour. After I had explained to him my errand, he said nothing, but moved away towards the ikons and began to read the exhortation. Whereupon I overcame my shame and told him all that was in my heart. Finally, he laid his hands upon my head and pronounced in his even, resonant voice the words, "My son, may the blessing of our Heavenly Father be upon thee, and may He always preserve thee in faithfulness, loving-kindness, and meekness. Amen." I was entirely happy. Tears of joy coursed down my face as I kissed the hem of his cassock and then raised my head again. The face of the priest expressed perfect tranquillity. So keenly did I feel the joy of reconciliation that, fearing in any way to dispel it, I took hasty leave of him, and, without looking to one side of me or the other, in order that my attention might not be distracted, left the grounds and re-entered the rickety, battered drozhki. Yet the joltings of the vehicle and the variety of objects which flitted past my eyes soon dissipated that feeling, and I became filled with nothing but the idea that the priest must have thought me the finest-spirited young man he had ever met, or ever would meet, in the whole of his life. Indeed, I reflected, there could not be many such as myself. Of that I felt sure, and the conviction produced in me the kind of complacency which craves for self-communication to another. I had a great desire to unbosom myself to some one, and as there was no one else to speak to, I addressed myself to the cabman. "Was I very long gone?" I asked him. "No, not very long," he replied. He seemed to have grown more cheerful under the influence of the sunshine. "Yet now it is a good while past my horse's feeding time. You see, I am a night cabman." "Well, I only seemed to myself to be about a minute," I went on. "Do you know what I went there for?" I added, changing my seat to the well of the drozhki so as to be nearer the driver. "What business is it of mine? I drive a fare where he tells me to go," he replied. "Yes, but all the same, what do you think I went there for?" I persisted. "I expect some one you know is going to be buried there, so you went to see about a plot for the grave." "No, no, my friend. Still, do you know what I went there for?" "No, of course I cannot tell, Baron," he repeated. His voice seemed to me so kind that I decided to edify him by relating the cause of my expedition, and even telling him of the feeling which I had experienced. "Shall I tell you?" I said. "Well, you see—" And I told him all, as well as inflicted upon him a description of my fine sentiments. To this day I blush at the recollection. "Well, well," said the cabman, non-committally, and for a long while afterwards he remained silent and motionless, except that at intervals he adjusted the skirt of his coat each time that it was jerked from beneath his leg by the joltings of his huge boot on the drozhki's step. I felt sure that he must be thinking of me even as the priest had done. That is to say, that he must be thinking that no such fine-spirited young man existed in the world as I. Suddenly he shot at me, "I tell you what, Baron, you ought to keep God's affairs to yourself." "What?" I said. "Those affairs of yours. They are God's business," he repeated, mumbling the words with his toothless lips. "No, he has not understood me," I thought to myself, and said no more to him till we reached home. Although it was not my original sense of reconciliation and reverence, but only a sort of complacency at having experienced such a sense that lasted in me during the drive home, and that, too, despite the distraction of the crowds of people who now thronged the sunlit streets in every direction, I had no sooner reached home than even my spurious complacency was shattered, for I found that I had not the 40 kopecks wherewith to pay the cabman. To the butler Gabriel I already owed a small debt, and he refused to lend me any more. Seeing me twice run across the courtyard in quest of the money, the cabman must have divined the reason, for, leaping from his drozhki, he, notwithstanding that he had seemed so kind, began to bawl aloud, with an evident desire to punch my head, that people who do not pay for their cab rides are swindlers. None of my family were yet out of bed, so that, except for the servants, there was no one from whom to borrow the 40 kopecks. At length, on my most sacred word of honour to repay, a word to which, as I could see from his face, he did not altogether trust, Basil so far yielded to his fondness for me and his remembrance of the many services I had done for him, as to pay the cabman. Thus, all my beautiful feelings ended in smoke. When I went upstairs to dress for church and go to communion with the rest, I found that my new clothes had not yet come home, and so I could not wear them. Then I sinned headlong. Donning my other suit, I went to communion in a sad state of mental perturbation, and filled with complete distrust of all my finer impulses. End of Section 2. Recording by Bill Borst. Section 3 of Youth by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by C.J. Hogarth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 3. Chapters 9 through 12. Chapter 9. How I Prepared Myself for the Examinations. On the Thursday in Easter week, Papa, my sister Katenka, and Mimi went away into the country, and no one remained in my grandmother's great house but Woloda, St. Jerome, and myself. The frame of mind which I had experienced on the day of my confession and during my subsequent expedition to the monastery had now completely passed away, and left behind it only a dim, though pleasing, memory, which daily became more and more submerged by the impressions of this emancipated existence. The folio endorsed "Rules of My Life" lay concealed beneath a pile of schoolbooks. Although the idea of the possibility of framing rules for every occasion in my life, and always letting myself be guided by them, still pleased me, since it appeared an idea at once simple and magnificent, and I was determined to make practical applications of it, I seemed somehow to have forgotten to put it into practice at once, and kept deferring doing so until such and such a moment. At the same time, I took pleasure in the thought that every idea which now entered my head could be allotted precisely to one or other of my three sections of tasks and duties: those for or to God, those for or to my neighbour, and those for or to myself. I can always refer everything to them, I said to myself, as well as the many, many other ideas which occur to me on one subject or another. Yet at this period I often asked myself, was I better and more truthful when I only believed in the power of the human intellect? Or am I more so now, when I am losing the faculty of developing that power, and am in doubt both as to its potency and as to its importance? To this I could return no positive answer. The sense of freedom, combined with the spring-like feeling of vague expectation to which I have referred already, so unsettled me that I could not keep myself in hand, could make none but the sorriest of preparations for my university ordeal. Thus I was busy in the schoolroom one morning, and fully aware that I must work hard, seeing that tomorrow was the day of my examination in a subject of which I had the two whole questions still to read up. Yet no sooner had a breath of spring come wafted through the window than I felt as though there were something quite different that I wished to recall to my memory. My hands laid down my book, my feet began to move of themselves, and to set me walking up and down the room, and my head felt as though some one had suddenly touched in it a little spring and set some machine in motion. So easily and swiftly and naturally did all sorts of pleasing fancies, of which I could catch no more than the radiancy, begin coursing through it. Thus 1 hour, 2 hours elapsed unperceived. Even if I sat down determinedly to my book and managed to concentrate my whole attention upon what I was reading, suddenly there would sound in the corridor the footsteps of a woman and the rustle of her dress. Instantly everything would escape my mind, and I would find it impossible to remain still any longer, however much I knew that the woman could only be either Gasha or my grandmother's old sewing-maid moving about in the corridor. Yet suppose it should be she all at once, I would say to myself. Suppose it is beginning now, and I were to lose it. And darting out into the corridor, I would find each time that it was only Gasha. Yet, for long enough afterwards, I could not recall my attention to my studies. A little spring had been touched in my head, and a strange mental ferment started afresh. Again, that evening, I was sitting alone beside a tallow candle in my room. Suddenly I looked up for a moment, to snuff the candle or to straighten myself in my chair, and at once became aware of nothing but the darkness in the corners and the blank of the open doorway. Then I also became conscious how still the house was, and felt as though I could do nothing else than go on listening to that stillness, and gazing into the black square of that open doorway. and gradually sinking into a brown study as I sat there without moving. At intervals, however, I would get up, and go downstairs, and begin wandering through the empty rooms. Once I sat a long while in the small drawing-room as I listened to Gasha playing "The Nightingale" with 2 fingers on the piano in the large drawing-room, where a solitary candle burned. Later, when the moon was bright, I felt obliged to get out of bed and to lean out of the window, so that I might gaze into the garden and at the lighted roof of the Shaposnikof mansion, the straight tower of our parish church, and the dark shadows of the fence and the lilac bush where they lay black upon the path. So long did I remain there that when I at length returned to bed, it was 10 o'clock in the morning before I could open my eyes again. In short, had it not been for the tutors who came to give me lessons, as well as for St. Jerome, who at intervals and very grudgingly applied a spur to my self-conceit, and most of all for the desire to figure as clever in the eyes of my friend Nechludoff, who looked upon distinctions in university examinations as a matter of first-rate importance, had it not been for all these things, I say, the spring and my new freedom would have combined to make me forget everything I had ever learnt, and so go through the examinations to no purpose whatsoever. Chapter 10. The Examination in History. On the 16th of April I entered for the first time, and under the wing of St. Jerome, the great hall of the University. I had driven there with St. Jerome in our smart phaeton, and wearing the first frock-coat of my life, while the whole of my other clothes, even down to my socks and linen, were new and of a grander sort. When a Swiss waiter relieved me of my greatcoat, and I stood before him in all the beauty of my attire, I felt almost sorry to dazzle him so. Yet I had no sooner entered the bright, carpeted, crowded hall, and caught sight of hundreds of other young men in gymnasium (the Russian gymnasium equals the English grammar or secondary school), uniforms or frock-coats, of whom but a few threw me an indifferent glance, as well as, at the far end, some solemn-looking professors, who were seated on chairs or walking carelessly about among some tables, then I at once became disabused of the notion that I should attract the general attention, while the expression of my face, which at home, and even in the vestibule of the University buildings, had denoted only a kind of vague regret that I should have to present so important and distinguished an appearance, became exchanged for an expression of the most acute nervousness and dejection. However, I soon picked up again when I perceived sitting at one of the desks a very badly, untidily dressed gentleman, who, though not really old, was almost entirely grey. He was occupying a seat quite at the back of the hall, and a little apart from the rest, so I hastened to sit down beside him, and then fell to looking at the candidates for examination, and to forming conclusions about them. Many different figures and faces were there to be seen there. Yet, in my opinion, they all seemed to divide themselves into 3 classes. First of all, there were youths like myself, attending for examination in the company of their parents or tutors. Among such I could see the youngest Iwin, accompanied by Frost, and Ilinka Grap, accompanied by his old father. All youths of this class wore the early beginnings of beards, sported prominent linen, sat quietly in their places, and never opened the books and notebooks which they had brought with them, but gazed at the professors and examination tables with ill-concealed nervousness. The second class of candidates were young men in gymnasium uniforms. Several of them had attained to the dignity of shaving, and most of them knew one another. They talked loudly, called the professors by their names and surnames, occupied themselves in getting their subjects ready, exchanged notebooks, climbed over desks, fetched themselves pies and sandwiches from the vestibule, and ate them then and there, merely lowering their heads to the level of a desk for propriety's sake. Lastly, the third class of candidates, which seemed a small one, consisted of oldish men, some of them in frock-coats, but the majority in jackets, and with no linen to be seen. These preserved a serious demeanour, sat by themselves, and had a very dingy look. The man who had afforded me consolation by being worse dressed than myself belonged to this class. Leaning forward upon his elbows, and running his fingers through his grey dishevelled hair as he read some book or another, he had thrown me only a momentary glance, and that not a very friendly one, from a pair of glittering eyes. Then, as I sat down, he had frowned grimly, and stuck a shiny elbow out to prevent me from coming any nearer. On the other hand, The gymnasium men were over-sociable, and I felt rather afraid of their proximity. One of them did not hesitate to thrust a book into my hands, saying, "Give that to that fellow over there, will you?" while another of them exclaimed as he pushed past me, "By your leave, young fellow," and a third made use of my shoulder as a prop when he wanted to scramble over a desk. All this seemed to me a little rough and unpleasant, for I looked upon myself as immensely superior to such fellows, and considered that they ought not to treat me with such familiarity. At length the names began to be called out. The gymnasium men walked out boldly, answered their questions, apparently, well, and came back looking cheerful. My own class of candidates were much more diffident, as well as appeared to answer worse. Of the oldish men, some answered well, and some very poorly. When the name Semenoff was called out, my neighbour with the grey hair and glittering eyes jostled me roughly, stepped over my legs, and went up to one of the examiners' tables. It was plain from the aspect of the professors that he answered well and with assurance. Yet, on returning to his place, he did not wait to see where he was placed on the list, but quietly collected his notebooks and departed. Several times I shuddered at the sound of the voice calling out the names, but my turn did not come in exact alphabetical order, though already names had begun to be called beginning with I. "Ikonin and Tenieff!" suddenly shouted some one from the professor's end of the hall. "Go on, Ikonin, you are being called," said a tall, red-faced gymnasium student near me. "But who is this Bartenieff, or Mortenieff, or somebody? I don't know him." "It must be you," whispered St. Jerome loudly in my ear. "My name is Irtenieff," I said to the red-faced student. "Do you think that was the name they were calling out?" "Yes. Why on earth don't you go up?" he replied. "Lord, what a dandy!" he added under his breath, yet not so quietly but that I failed to hear the words as they came wafted to me from below the desk. In front of me walked Ikonin, a tall young man of about 25, who was one of those whom I had classed as oldish men. He wore a tight brown frock-coat and a blue satin tie, and had wisps of flaxen hair carefully brushed over his collar in the peasant style. His appearance had already caught my attention when we were sitting among the desks, and had given me an impression that he was not bad-looking. Also, I had noticed that he was very talkative. Yet what struck me most about his physiognomy was a tuft of queer red hairs which he had under his chin, as well as, still more, a strange habit of continually unbuttoning his waistcoat and scratching his chest under his shirt. Behind the table to which we were summoned sat 3 professors, none of whom acknowledged our salutations. A youngish professor was shuffling a bundle of tickets like a pack of cards. Another one, with a star on his frock-coat, was gazing hard at a gymnasium student, who was repeating something at great speed about Charles the Great, and adding to each of his sentences the word "nakonets" equals the English colloquialism "you know," while a third one, an old man in spectacles, proceeded to bend his head down as we approached and, peering at us through his glasses, pointed silently to the tickets. I felt his glance go over both myself and Ikonin, and also felt sure that something about us had displeased him. Perhaps it was Ikonin's red hairs, for, after taking another look at the pair of us, he motioned impatiently to us to be quick in taking our tickets. I felt vexed and offended, firstly, because none of the professors had responded to our bows, and secondly, because they evidently coupled me with Ikonin under the one denomination of candidates, and so were condemning me in advance on account of Ikonin's red hairs. I took my ticket boldly and made ready to answer, but the professor's eye passed over my head and alighted upon Ikonin. Accordingly, I occupied myself in reading my ticket. The questions printed on it were all familiar to me, so as I silently awaited my turn, I gazed at what was passing near me. Ikonin seemed in no way diffident, rather than the reverse, for in reaching for his ticket he threw his body half-way across the table. Then he gave his long hair a shake, and rapidly conned over what was written on his ticket. I think he had just opened his mouth to answer when the professor with the star dismissed the gymnasium student with a word of commendation, and then turned and looked at Ikonin. At once the latter seemed taken back, and stopped short. For about 2 minutes there was a dead silence. "Well?" said the professor in the spectacles. Once more Ikonin opened his mouth, and once more remained silent. "Come! You are not the only one to be examined. "Do you mean to answer, or do you not?" said the youngish Professor, but Ikonin did not even look at him. He was gazing fixedly at his ticket and uttered not a single word. The Professor in the spectacles scanned him through his glasses, then over them, then without them, for indeed he had time to take them off, to wipe their lenses carefully, and to replace them. Still not a word from Ikonin. All at once, however, a smile spread itself over his face, and he gave his long hair another shake. Next, he reached across the table, laid down his ticket, looked at each of the professors in turn and then at myself, and finally, wheeling round on his heels, made a gesture with his hand and returned to the desks. The professors stared blankly at one another. "Bless the fellow!" said the youngish Professor. "What an original!" It was now my turn to move towards the table, but the professors went on talking in undertones among themselves, as though they were unaware of my presence. At the moment I felt firmly persuaded that the three of them were engrossed solely with the question of whether I should merely pass the examination or whether I should pass it well, and that it was only swagger which made them pretend that they did not care either way, and behave as though they had not seen me. When at length the Professor in the spectacles turned to me with an air of indifference, and invited me to answer, I felt hurt, as I looked at him, to think that he should have so undeceived me. Wherefore I answered brokenly at first. In time, however, things came easier to my tongue, and inasmuch as all the questions bore upon Russian history, which I knew thoroughly, I ended with éclat, and even went so far, in my desire to convince the professors that I was not Ikonin, and that they must not in any way confound me with him, as to offer to draw a second ticket. The Professor in the spectacles, however, merely nodded his head, said "That will do," and marked something in his register. On returning to the desks, I at once learnt from the gymnasium men, who somehow seemed to know everything, that I had been placed fifth. Chapter 11. My examination in mathematics. At the subsequent examinations, I made several new acquaintances in addition to the Grapes, whom I considered unworthy of my notice, and Iwin, who for some reason or other avoided me. With some of these new friends I grew quite intimate, and even Ikonin plucked up sufficient courage to inform me, when we next met, that he would have to undergo re-examination in history, the reason for his failure this time being that the professor of that faculty had never forgiven him for last year's examination, and had, indeed, almost killed him for it. Semenoff, who was destined for the same faculty as myself, the faculty of mathematics, avoided every one up to the very close of the examinations. Always leaning forward upon his elbows and running his fingers through his grey hair, he sat silent and alone. Nevertheless, when called up for examination in mathematics (he had no companion to accompany him), he came out second. The first place was taken by a student from the first gymnasium, a tall, dark, lanky, pale-faced fellow who wore a black folded cravat and had his cheeks and forehead dotted all over with pimples. His hands were shapely and slender, but their nails were so bitten to the quick that the finger ends looked as though they had been tied round with strips of thread. All this seemed to me splendid, and wholly becoming to a student of the first gymnasium. He spoke to every one, and we all made friends with him. To me, in particular, his walk, his every movement, his lips, his dark eyes, all seemed to have in them something extraordinary and magnetic. On the day of the mathematical examination I arrived earlier than usual at the hall. I knew the syllabus well, yet there were two questions in the algebra which my tutor had managed to pass over, and which were therefore quite unknown to me. If I remember rightly, they were the theory of combinations and Newton's binomial. I seated myself on one of the back benches and pored over the two questions, but, inasmuch as I was not accustomed to working in a noisy room, and had even less time for preparation than I had anticipated, I soon found it difficult to take in all that I was reading. "Here he is! This way, Nechludoff!" said Woloda's familiar voice behind me. I turned and saw my brother and Dimitri, their gowns unbuttoned and their hands waving a greeting to me, threading their way through the desks. A moment's glance would have sufficed to show any one that they were second-course students, persons to whom the University was as a second home. The mere look of their open gowns expressed at once disdain for the mere candidate and a knowledge that the mere candidate's soul was filled with envy and admiration of them. I was charmed to think that every one near me could now see that I knew 2 real second-course students, wherefore I hastened to meet them half-way. Woloda, of course, could not help vaunting his superiority a little. "Hullo, you smug!" he said. "Haven't you been examined yet?" "No." "Well, what are you reading? Aren't you sufficiently primed?" "Yes, except in 2 questions. I don't understand them at all." What?" And Woloda straightway began to expound to me Newton's binomial, but so rapidly and unintelligibly that, suddenly reading in my eyes certain misgivings as to the soundness of his knowledge, he glanced also at Dimitri's face. Clearly he saw the same misgivings there, for he blushed hotly, though still continuing his involved explanations. "No. Hold on, Woloda, and let me try to do it," put in Dimitri at length, with a glance at the professor's corner as he seated himself beside me. I could see that my friend was in the best of humours. This was always the case with him when he was satisfied with himself, and was one of the things in him which I liked best. Inasmuch as he knew mathematics well and could speak clearly, he hammered the question so thoroughly into my head that I can remember it to this day. Hardly had he finished when St. Jerome said to me in a loud whisper, "À vous, Nicolas," and I followed Ikonin out from among the desks without having had an opportunity of going through the other question, of which I was ignorant. At the table which we now approached were seated 2 professors, while before the blackboard stood a gymnasium student, who was working some formula aloud and knocking bits off the end of the chalk with his 2 vigorous strokes. He even continued writing after one of the professors had said to him, "Enough," and bidden us draw our tickets. "Suppose I get the theory of combinations," I thought to myself as my tremulous fingers took a ticket from among a bundle wrapped in torn paper. Ikonin, for his part, reached across the table with the same assurance, and the same sidelong movement of his whole body, as he had done at the previous examination. Taking the topmost ticket without troubling to make further selection, he just glanced at it, then frowned angrily. "I always draw this kind of thing," he muttered. I looked at mine. Horrors! It was the theory of combinations. "What have you got?" whispered Ikonin at this point. I showed him. "Oh, I know that," he said. "Will you make an exchange, then?" "No. Besides, it would be all the same for me if I did," he contrived to whisper, just as the professor called us up to the blackboard. "I don't feel up to anything today." "Then everything is lost," I thought to myself. Instead of the brilliant result which I had anticipated, I should be for ever covered with shame, more so even than Ikonin. Suddenly, under the very eyes of the professor, Ikonin turned to me, snatched my ticket out of my hands, and handed me his own. I looked at his ticket. It was Newton's binomial. The professor was a youngish man with a pleasant, clever expression of face, an effect chiefly due to the prominence of the lower part of his forehead. "What? Are you exchanging tickets, gentlemen?" he said. "No. He only gave me his to look at, Professor," answered Ikonin, and, sure enough, the word "professor" was the last word that he uttered there. Once again he stepped backwards towards me from the table. Once again he looked at each of the professors in turn, and then at myself. Once again he smiled faintly, and once again he shrugged his shoulders as much as to say, "It is no use, my good sirs." Then he returned to the desks. Subsequently I learnt that this was the 3rd year he had vainly attempted to matriculate. I answered my question well, for I had just read it up, and the professor, kindly informing me that I had done even better than was required, placed me 5th. Chapter 12. My examination in Latin. All went well until my examination in Latin. So far, a gymnasium student stood first on the list, Semenoff second, and myself third. On the strength of it I had begun to swagger a little, and to think that, for all my youth, I was not to be despised. From the first day of the examinations I had heard every one speak with awe of the professor of Latin, who appeared to be some sort of a wild beast who battened on the financial ruin of young men, of those, that is to say, who paid their own fees, and spoke only in the Greek and Latin tongues. However, St. Jerome, who had coached me in Latin, spoke encouragingly, and I myself thought that since I could translate Cicero and certain parts of Horace without the aid of a lexicon, I should do no worse than the rest. Yet things proved otherwise. All the morning the air had been full of rumours concerning the tribulations of candidates who had gone up before me. rumours of how one young fellow had been accorded a naught, another one a single mark only, a third one greeted with abuse and threatened with expulsion, and so forth. Only Semenoff and the first gymnasium student had, as usual, gone up quietly and returned to their seats with 5 marks credited to their names. Already I felt a prescience of disaster when Ikonin and myself found ourselves summoned to the little table at which the terrible professor sat in solitary grandeur. The terrible professor turned out to be a little, thin, bilious-looking man with hair long and greasy and a face expressive of extraordinary sullenness. Handing Ikonin a copy of Cicero's orations, he bid him translate. To my great astonishment, Ikonin not only read off some of the Latin, but even managed to construe a few lines to the professor's prompting. At the same time, conscious of my superiority over such a feeble companion, I could not help smiling a little, and even looking rather contemptuous, when it came to a question of analysis, and Ikonin, as on previous occasions, plunged into a silence which promised never to end. I had hoped to please the professor by that knowing, slightly sarcastic smile of mine, but, as a matter of fact, I contrived to do quite the contrary. "Evidently you know better than he, since you are laughing," he said to me in bad Russian. "Well, we shall see. Tell me the answer, then." Later I learnt that the professor was Ikonin's guardian, and that Ikonin actually lived with him. I lost no time in answering the question in syntax which had been put to Ikonin, but the professor only pulled a long face and turned away from me. "Well, your turn will come presently, and then we shall see how much you know," he remarked, without looking at me, but proceeding to explain to Ikonin the point on which he had questioned him. "That will do," he added, and I saw him put down 4 marks to Ikonin in his register. "Come," I thought to myself, "he cannot be so strict after all." When Ikonin had taken his departure, the professor spent fully 5 minutes which seemed to me 5 hours, in setting his books and tickets in order, in blowing his nose, in adjusting and sprawling about on his chair, in gazing down the hall, and in looking here, there, and everywhere, in doing everything, in fact, except once letting his eye rest upon me. Yet even that amount of dissimulation did not seem to satisfy him, for he next opened a book and pretended to read it, for all the world as though I were not there at all. I moved a little nearer him and gave a cough. "Ah, yes, you too, of course. Well, translate me something," he remarked, handing me a book of some kind. "But no, you had better take this," and turning over the leaves of a Horace, he indicated to me a passage which I should never have imagined possible of translation. "I have not prepared this," I said. "Oh, then you only wish to answer things which you have got by heart, do you? Indeed! No, no. Translate me that." I started to grope for the meaning of the passage, but each questioning look which I threw at the professor was met by a shake of the head, a profound sigh, and an exclamation of "No, no!" Finally he banged the book to with such a snap that he caught his finger between the covers. Angrily releasing it, he handed me a ticket containing questions in grammar, and, flinging himself back in his chair, maintained a menacing silence. I should have tried to answer the questions had not the expression of his face so clogged my tongue that nothing seemed to come from it right. "No, no, that's not it at all!" he suddenly exclaimed in his horrible accent as he altered his posture to one of leaning forward upon the table and playing with the gold signet ring which was nearly slipping from the little finger of his left hand. "That is not the way to prepare for serious study, my good sir. Fellows like yourself think that, once they have a gown and a blue collar to their backs, they have reached the summit of all things and become students. No, no, my dear sir. A subject needs to be studied fundamentally," and so on, and so on. During this speech, which was uttered with a clipped sort of intonation, I went on staring dully at his lowered eyelids. Beginning with a fear lest I should lose my place as third on the list, I went on to fear lest I should pass at all. Next, these feelings became reinforced by a sense of injustice, injured self-respect, and unmerited humiliation, while the contempt which I felt for the professor as some one not quite according to my ideas comme il faut, a fact which I deduced from the shortness, strength, and brownness of his nails, flared up in me more and turned all my other feelings to sheer animosity. Happening presently to glance at me, and to note my quivering lips and tear-filled eyes, he seemed to interpret my agitation as a desire to be accorded my marks and dismissed, wherefore, with an air of relenting, he said, in the presence of another professor who had just approached, "Very well, I will accord you a pass," which signified 2 marks, "although you do not deserve it. I do so simply out of consideration for your youth, and in the hope that when you begin your university career you will learn to be less light-minded." The concluding phrase, uttered in the hearing of the other professor, who at once turned his eyes upon me as though remarking, "There, you see, young man," completed my discomfiture. For a moment a mist swam before my eyes, a mist in which the terrible professor seemed to be far away as he sat at his table, while for an instant a wild idea danced through my brain. What if I did do such a thing, I thought to myself. What would come of it? However, I did not do the thing in question, but, on the contrary, made a bow of peculiar reverence to each of the professors, and with a slight smile on my face, presumably the same smile as that with which I had derided Ikonin, turned away from the table. This piece of unfairness affected me so powerfully at the time that, had I been a free agent, I should have attended for no more examinations. My ambition was gone, since now I could not possibly be third, and I therefore let the other examinations pass without any exertion, or even agitation, on my part. In the general list I still stood fourth, but that failed to interest me, since I had reasoned things out to myself and come to the conclusion that to try for first place was stupid, even bad form; that, in fact, it was better to pass neither very well nor very badly, as Woloda had done. This attitude I decided to maintain throughout the whole of my university career, notwithstanding that it was the first point on which my opinion had differed from that of my friend Dimitri. Yet, to tell the truth, my thoughts were already turning towards a uniform, a mortar-board, and the possession of a drozhki of my own, a room of my own, and, above all, freedom of my own, and certainly the prospect had its charm. End of Section 3. Recording by Bill Borst. Section 4 of Youth by Leo Tolstoy, translated by C.J. Hogarth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 4, Chapters 13 through 16. Chapter 13. I Become Grown Up. When, on May 8th, I returned home from the final, the divinity examination, I found my acquaintance, the foreman from Rozanov's, awaiting me. He had called once before to fit me for my gown, as well as for a tunic of glossy black cloth, the lapels of which were, on that occasion, only sketched in chalk. But to-day he had come to bring me the clothes in their finished state, with their gilt buttons wrapped in tissue paper. Donning the garments, and finding them splendid, notwithstanding that St. Jerome assured me that the back of the tunic wrinkled badly, I went downstairs with a complacent smile which I was powerless to banish from my face, and sought Woloda, trying the while to affect unconsciousness of the admiring looks of the servants, who came darting out of the hall and corridor to gaze upon me with ravished eyes. Gabriel, the butler, overtook me in the salle, and, after congratulating me with much empressement, handed me, according to instructions from my father, 4 banknotes, as well as informed me that Papa had also given orders that, from that day forth, the groom Kuzma, the phaeton, and the bay horse Krassavchik were to be entirely at my disposal. I was so overjoyed at this not altogether expected good fortune that I could no longer feign indifference in Gabriel's presence, but, flustered and panting, said the first thing which came into my head. "Krassavchik is a splendid trotter," I think it was. Then, catching sight of the various heads protruding from the doors of the hall and corridor, I felt that I could bear no more, and set off running at full speed across the salle, dressed as I was in the new tunic, with its shining gilt buttons. Just as I burst into Woloda's room, I heard behind me the voices of Dubkoff and Nechludoff, who had come to congratulate me, as well as to propose a dinner somewhere and the drinking of much champagne in honour of my matriculation. Dimitri informed me that, though he did not care for champagne, he would nevertheless join us that evening and drink my health, while Dubkoff remarked that I looked almost like a colonel, and Woloda omitted to congratulate me at all, merely saying in an acid way that he supposed we should now, in other words, in 2 days' time, be off into the country. The truth was that Woloda, though pleased at my matriculation, did not altogether like my becoming as grown up as himself. St. Jerome, who also joined us at this moment, said in a very pompous manner that his duties were now ended, and that, although he did not know whether they had been well done or ill, at least he had done his best, and must depart tomorrow to his counts. In replying to their various remarks, I could feel in spite of myself a pleased, agreeable, faintly self-sufficient smile playing over my countenance, as well as could remark that that smile communicated itself to those to whom I was speaking. So here I was without a tutor, yet with my own private drozhki, my name printed on the list of students, a sword and belt of my own, and a chance of an occasional salute from officials. In short, I was grown up and, I suppose, happy. Finally, we arranged to go out and dine at 5 o'clock, but since Woloda presently went off to Dubkoff's and Dimitri disappeared in his usual fashion, saying that there was something he must do before dinner, I was left with 2 whole hours still at my disposal. For a time I walked through the rooms of the house and looked at myself in all the mirrors, firstly with the tunic buttoned, then with it unbuttoned, and lastly with only the top button fastened. Each time it looked splendid. Eventually, though anxious not to show any excess of delight, I found myself unable to refrain from crossing over to the coach-house and stables to gaze at Krassovchik, Kuzma, and the drozhki. Then I returned, and once more began my tour of the rooms, where I looked at myself in all the mirrors as before, and counted my money over in my pocket, my face smiling happily the while. Yet not an hour had elapsed before I began to feel slightly ennuyé, to feel a shade of regret that no one was present to see me in my splendid position. I began to long for life and movement, and so sent out orders for the drozhki to be got ready, since I had made up my mind to drive to the Kuznetsky Bridge and make some purchases. In this connection I recalled how, after matriculating, Woloda had gone and bought himself a lithograph of horses by Victor Adam, and some pipes and tobacco, wherefore I felt that I too must do the same. Amid glances showered upon me from every side, and with the sunlight reflected from my buttons, cap-badge, and sword, I drove to the Kuznetsky Bridge, where, halting at a picture shop, I entered it with my eyes looking to every side. It was not precisely horses by Adam which I meant to buy, since I did not wish to be accused of too closely imitating Woloda; wherefore, out of shame for causing the obsequious shopmen such agitation as I appeared to do, I made a hasty selection, and pitched upon a water-colour of a woman's head which I saw displayed in the window, price 20 roubles. Yet no sooner had I paid the 20 roubles over the counter than my heart smote me for having put 2 such beautifully dressed shop assistants to so much trouble for such a trifle. Moreover, I fancied that they were regarding me with some disdain. Accordingly, in my desire to show them what manner of man I was, I turned my attention to a silver trifle which I saw displayed in a showcase, and, recognizing that it was a porte-crayon, price 18 roubles, requested that it should forthwith be wrapped in paper for me. Next, the money paid, and the information acquired that the splendid pipes and tobacco were to be obtained in an adjacent emporium, I bowed to the 2 shopmen politely, and issued into the street with the picture under my arm. At the shop next door, which had painted on its sign-board a negro smoking a cigar, I bought, likewise out of a desire to imitate no one, some Turkish tobacco, a Stamboul hookah, and 2 pipes. On coming out of the shop, I had just entered the drozhki when I caught sight of Semenoff, who was walking hurriedly along the pavement with his head bent down. Vexed that he should not have recognized me, I called out to him pretty loudly, "Hold on a minute!" and, whipping up the drozhki, soon overtook him. "How do you do?" I said. "My respects to you," he replied, but without stopping. "Why are you not in your University uniform?" I next inquired. At this he stopped short with a frown, and parted his white teeth as though the sun were hurting his eyes. The next moment, however, he threw a glance of studied indifference at my drozhki and uniform, and continued on his way. From the Kuznetsky Bridge, I drove to a confectioner's in Tverskaya Street, and, much as I should have liked it to be supposed that it was the newspapers which most interested me, I had no choice but to begin falling upon tartlet after tartlet. In fact, for all my bashfulness before a gentleman who kept regarding me with some curiosity from behind a newspaper, I ate with great swiftness a tartlet of each of the 8 different sorts which the confectioner kept. On reaching home I experienced a slight touch of stomachache, but paid no attention to it, and set to work to inspect my purchases. Of these, the picture so much displeased me that, instead of having it framed and hung in my room, as Woloda had done with his, I took pains to hide it behind a chest of drawers, where no one could see it. Likewise, though I also found the porte-crayon distasteful, I was able, as I laid it on my table, to comfort myself with the thought that it was at least a silver article, so much capital as it were, and likely to be very useful to a student. As for the smoking things, I decided to put them into use at once, and try their capabilities. Unsealing the 4 packages, and carefully filling the Stamboul pipe with some fine-cut, reddish-yellow Turkish tobacco, I applied a hot cinder to it, and taking the mouthpiece between my first and second fingers, a position of the hand which greatly caught my fancy, started to inhale the smoke. The smell of the tobacco seemed delightful, yet something burnt my mouth and caught me by the breath. Nevertheless, I hardened my heart, and continued to draw abundant fumes into my interior. Then I tried blowing rings and retaining the smoke. Soon the room became filled with blue vapours, while the pipe started to crackle and the tobacco to fly out in sparks. Presently also I began to feel a smarting in my mouth and a giddiness in my head. Accordingly, I was on the point of stopping and going to look at myself and my pipe in the mirror, when, to my surprise, I found myself staggering about. The room was whirling round and round, and as I peered into the mirror, which I reached only with some difficulty, I perceived that my face was as white as a sheet. Hardly had I thrown myself down upon a sofa when such nausea and faintness swept over me that, making up my mind that the pipe had proved my death, I expected every moment to expire. Terribly frightened, I tried to call out for some one to come and help me, and to send for the doctor. However, this panic of mine did not last long, for I soon understood what the matter was, and remained lying on the sofa with a racking headache and my limbs relaxed as I stared dully at the stamp on the package of tobacco, the pipe tube coiled on the floor, and the odds and ends of tobacco and confectioners' tartlets which were littered about. Truly, I thought to myself in my dejection and disillusionment, I cannot be quite grown up, if I cannot smoke as other fellows do, and should be fated never to hold a chibouk between my first and second fingers, or to inhale and puff smoke through a flaxen moustache. When Dimitri called for me at 5 o'clock, he found me in this unpleasant predicament. After drinking a glass of water, however, I felt nearly recovered, and ready to go with him. "So much for your trying to smoke," said he, as he gazed at the remnants of my debauch. "It is a silly thing to do, and waste of money as well. I long ago promised myself never to smoke. But come along, we have to call for Dubkoff." Chapter 14. How Woloda and Dubkoff amused themselves. The moment that Dimitri entered my room, I perceived from his face, manner of walking, and the signs which in him denoted ill-humour, a blinking of the eyes, and a grim holding of his head to one side, as though to straighten his collar, that he was in the coldly correct frame of mind which was his when he felt dissatisfied with himself. It was a frame of mind, too, which always produced a chilling effect upon my feelings towards him. Of late I had begun to observe and appraise my friend's character a little more, but our friendship had in no way suffered from that, since it was still too young and strong for me to be able to look upon Dimitri as anything but perfect, no matter in what light I regarded him. In him there were 2 personalities, both of which I thought beautiful. One, which I loved devotedly, was kind, mild, forgiving, gay, and conscious of being those various things. When he was in this frame of mind, his whole exterior, the very tone of his voice, his every movement, appeared to say, "I am kind and good-natured, and rejoice in being so, and every one can see that I so rejoice." The other of his 2 personalities, one which I had only just begun to apprehend, and before the majesty of which I bowed in spirit, was that of a man who was cold, stern to himself and to others, proud, religious to the point of fanaticism, and pedantically moral. At the present moment he was, as I say, this second personality. With that frankness which constituted a necessary condition of our relations, I told him as soon as we entered the drozhki how much it depressed and hurt me to see him, on this my fete day, in a frame of mind so irksome and disagreeable to me. "What has upset you so?" I asked him. "Will you not tell me?" "My dear Nicholas," was his slow reply as he gave his head a nervous twitch to one side and blinked his eyes, Since I have given you my word never to conceal anything from you, you have no reason to suspect me of secretiveness. One cannot always be in exactly the same mood, and if I seem at all put out, that is all there is to say about it." "What a marvellously open, honourable character his is!" I thought to myself, and dropped the subject. We drove the rest of the way to Dubkoff's in silence. Dubkoff's flat was an unusually fine one, or, at all events, so it seemed to me. Everywhere were rugs, pictures, gardenias, striped hangings, photographs, and curved settees, while on the walls hung guns, pistols, pouches, and the mounted heads of wild beasts. It was the appearance of this apartment which made me aware whom it was that Woloda had imitated in the scheme of his own sitting-room. We found Dubkoff and Woloda engaged in cards, while seated also at the table, and watching the game with close attention, was a gentleman whom I did not know, but who appeared to be of no great importance, judging by the modesty of his attitude. Dubkoff himself was in a silk dressing-gown and soft slippers, while Woloda, seated opposite him on a divan, was in his shirt-sleeves, as well as, to judge by his flushed face and the impatient cursory glance which he gave us for a second as he looked up from the cards, much taken up with the game. On seeing me, he reddened still more. "Well, it is for you to deal," he remarked to Dubkoff. In an instant I divined that he did not altogether relish my becoming acquainted with the fact that he gambled. Yet his expression had nothing in it of confusion, only a look which seemed to me to say, "Yes, I play cards, and if you are surprised at that, it is only because you are so young. There is nothing wrong about it. It is necessity at our age." Yes, I at once divined and understood that. Instead of dealing, however, Dubkoff rose and shook hands with us, after which he bade us both be seated, and then offered us pipes, which we declined. "Here is our diplomat, then, the hero of the day," he said to me. "Good Lord, how you look like a colonel!" I muttered in reply, though once more feeling a complacent smile overspread my countenance. I stood in that awe of Dubkoff which a 16-year-old boy naturally feels for a 27-year-old man, of whom his elders say that he is a very clever young man, who can dance well and speak French, and who, though secretly despising one's youth, endeavours to conceal the fact. Yet, despite my respect for him, I somehow found it difficult and uncomfortable, throughout my acquaintanceship with him, to look him in the eyes. I have since remarked that there are three kinds of men whom I cannot face easily, namely, those who are much better than myself, those who are much worse, and those between whom and myself there is a mutual determination not to mention some particular thing of which we both are aware. Dubkoff may have been a much better fellow than myself, or he may have been a much worse, but the point was that he lied very frequently without recognizing the fact that I was aware of his doing so, yet had determined not to mention it. "Let us play another round," said Woloda, hunching one shoulder after the manner of Papa, and reshuffling the cards. "How persistent you are," said Dubkoff. "We can play all we want to afterwards. Well, one more round, then." During the play I looked at their hands. Woloda's hands were large and red, whilst in the crook of the thumb and the way in which the other fingers curved themselves round the cards as he held them they so exactly resembled Papa's that now and then I could not help thinking that Woloda purposely held the cards thus so as to look the more like a grown-up. Yet the next moment, looking at his face, I could see that he had not a thought in his mind beyond the game. Dubkoff's hands, on the contrary, were small, puffy, and inclined to clench themselves, as well as extremely neat and small-fingered. They were just the kind of hands which generally display rings, and which are most to be seen on persons who are both inclined to use them and fond of objets de vertu. Woloda must have lost, for the gentleman who was watching the play remarked that Vladimir Petrovitch had terribly bad luck, while Dubkoff reached for a notebook, wrote something in it, and then, showing Woloda what he had written, said, "Is that right?" "Yes," said Woloda, glancing with feigned carelessness at the notebook. "Now let us go." Woloda took Dubkoff, and I gave Dimitri a lift in my drozhki. "What were they playing at?" I inquired of Dimitri. "At piquet. It is a stupid game. In fact, all such games are stupid." "And were they playing for much?" "No, not very much, but more than they ought to." "Do you ever play yourself?" "No, I swore never to do so, but Dubkoff will play with any one he can get hold of." "He ought not to do that," I remarked. "So Woloda does not play so well as he does?" "Perhaps Dubkoff ought not to, as you say. Yet there is nothing especially bad about it at all. He likes playing, and plays well, but he is a good fellow all the same." "I had no idea of this," I said. "We must not think ill of him," concluded Dimitri, "since he is a simply splendid fellow. I like him very much, and always shall like him in spite of his weakness." For some reason or another the idea occurred to me that, just because Dimitri stuck up so stoutly for Dubkoff, he neither liked nor respected him in reality, but was determined, out of stubbornness and a desire not to be accused of inconstancy, never to own to the fact. He was one of those people who love their friends their life long, not so much because those friends remain always dear to them, as because, having once, possibly mistakenly, liked a person, they look upon it as dishonourable to cease ever to do so. Chapter 15. I am feted at dinner. Dubkoff and Woloda knew every one at the restaurant by name, and every one, from the waiters to the proprietor, paid them great respect. No time was lost in allotting us a private room where a bottle of iced champagne, upon which I tried to look with as much indifference as I could, stood ready waiting for us, and where we were served with a most wonderful repast selected by Dubkoff from the French menu. The meal went off most gaily and agreeably, notwithstanding that Dubkoff, as usual, told us blood-curdling tales of doubtful veracity. Among others, a tale of how his grandmother once shot dead 3 robbers who were attacking her, a recital at which I blushed, closed my eyes, and turned away from the narrator, and that Woloda reddened visibly whenever I opened my mouth to speak, which was the more uncalled for on his part, seeing that never once, so far as I can remember, did I say anything shameful. After we had been given champagne, every one congratulated me, and I drank hands across with Dimitri and Dubkoff, and wished them joy. Since, however, I did not know to whom the bottle of champagne belonged (it was explained to me later that it was common property), I considered that, in return, I ought to treat my friends out of the money which I had never ceased to finger in my pocket. Accordingly, I stealthily extracted a 10-rouble note, and, beckoning the waiter to my side, handed him the money, and told him in a whisper, yet not so softly but that every one could hear me, seeing that every one was staring at me in dead silence, to "bring, if you please, a half-bottle of champagne." At this Woloda reddened again, and began to fidget so violently, and to gaze upon myself and every one else with such a distracted air, that I felt sure I had somehow put my foot in it. However, the half-bottle came, and we drank it with great gusto. After that, things went on merrily. Dubkoff continued his unending fairy tales, while Woloda also told funny stories, and told them well, too, in a way I should never have credited him, so that our laughter rang long and loud. Their best efforts lay in imitation, and in variants of a certain well-known saw. "Have you ever been abroad?" one would say to the other, for instance. "No," the one interrogated would reply, "but my brother plays the fiddle." Such perfection had the pair attained in this species of comic absurdity that they could answer any question by its means, while they would also endeavour to unite 2 absolutely unconnected matters without a previous question having been asked at all, yet say everything with a perfectly serious face, and produce a most comic effect. I, too, began to try to be funny, but as soon as ever I spoke they either looked at me askance, or did not look at me until I had finished, so that my anecdotes fell flat. Yet, though Dubkoff always remarked, "Our diplomat is lying, brother," I felt so exhilarated with the champagne in the company of my elders that the remark scarcely touched me. Only Dimitri, though he drank level with the rest of us, continued in the same severe, serious frame of mind, a fact which put a certain check upon the general hilarity. "Now look here, gentlemen," said Dubkoff at last. "After dinner we ought to take the diplomat in hand. How would it be for him to go with us to see Auntie? There we could put him through his paces." "Ah, but Nechludoff will not go there," objected Woloda. "Oh, unbearable, insupportable man of quiet habits that you are!" cried Dubkoff, turning to Dimitri. "Yet come with us, and you shall see what an excellent lady my dear Auntie is." "I will neither go myself nor let him go," replied Dimitri. "Let whom go? The diplomat? Why, you yourself saw how he brightened up at the very mention of Auntie." "It is not so much that I will not let him go," continued Dimitri, rising and beginning to pace the room without looking at me, "as that I neither wish him nor advise him to go. He is not a child now, and if he must go, he can go alone, without you. Surely you are ashamed of this, Dubkoff? Ashamed of always wanting others to do all the wrong things that you yourself do?" "But what is there so very wrong in my inviting you all to come and take a cup of tea with my aunt?" said Dubkoff, with a wink at Woloda. "If you don't like us going, it is your affair. Yet we are going all the same. Are you coming, Woloda?" "Yes, yes," assented Woloda. "We can go there, and then return to my rooms and continue our piquet." "Do you want to go with them or not?" said Dimitri, approaching me. "No," I replied, at the same time making room for him to sit down beside me on the divan. "I did not wish to go in any case, and since you advise me not to, nothing on earth will make me go now. Yet," I added a moment later, "I cannot honestly say that I have no desire to go. All I say is that I am glad I am not going." "That is right," he said. "Live your own life, and do not dance to any one's piping. That is the better way." This little tiff not only failed to mar our hilarity, but even increased it. Dimitri suddenly reverted to the kindly mood which I loved best. So great, as I afterwards remarked on more than one occasion, was the influence which the consciousness of having done a good deed exercised upon him. At the present moment the source of his satisfaction was the fact that he had stopped my expedition to Auntie's. He grew extraordinarily gay, called for another bottle of champagne, which was against his rules, invited some one who was a perfect stranger into our room, plied him with wine, sang "Gaudeamus Igitur," requested every one to join him in the chorus, and proposed that we should and drink at the Sokolniki Mews. "Let us enjoy ourselves tonight," he said with a laugh. "It is in honour of his matriculation that you now see me getting drunk for the first time in my life." Yet somehow this merriment sat ill upon him. He was like some good-natured father or tutor who is pleased with his young charges and lets himself go for their amusement, yet at the same time tries to show them that one can enjoy oneself decently and in an honourable manner. However, his unexpected gaiety had an infectious influence upon myself and my companions, and the more so because each of us had now drunk about half a bottle of champagne. It was in this pleasing frame of mind that I went out into the main salon to smoke a cigarette, which Dubkoff had given me. In rising, I noticed that my head seemed to swim a little, and that my legs and arms retained their natural positions only when I bent my thoughts determinedly upon them. At other moments my legs would deviate from the straight line, and my arms describe strange gestures. I concentrated my whole attention upon the members in question, forced my hands first to raise themselves and button my tunic, and then to smooth my hair, though they ruffled my locks in doing so, and lastly commanded my legs to march me to the door, a function which they duly performed, though at one time with too much reluctance and another with too much abandon, the left leg in particular coming to a halt every moment on tiptoe. Some one called out to me, "Where are you going to? They will bring you a cigar light directly." But I guessed the voice to be Woloda's, and feeling satisfied, somehow, that I had succeeded in divining the fact, merely smiled airily in reply, and continued on my way. Chapter 16. The Quarrel. In the main salon I perceived sitting at a small table a short, squat gentleman of the professional type. He had a red moustache, and was engaged in eating something or another, while by his side sat a tall, clean-shaven individual with whom he was carrying on a conversation in French. Somehow the aspect of these two persons displeased me. Yet I decided for all that to light my cigarette at the candelabrum which was standing before them. Looking from side to side to avoid meeting their gaze, I approached the table, and applied my cigarette to the flame. When it was fairly alight, I involuntarily threw a glance at the gentleman who was eating, and found his grey eyes fixed upon me with an expression of intense displeasure. Just as I was turning away, his red moustache moved a little, and he said in French, "I do not like people to smoke when I am dining, my good sir." I murmured something inaudible. "No, I do not like it at all," he went on sternly, and with a glance at his clean-shaven companion, as though inviting him to admire the way in which he was about to deal with me. "I do not like it, my good sir, nor do I like people who have the impudence to puff their smoke up one's very nose." By this time I had gathered that it was myself he was scolding, and at first felt as though I had been altogether in the wrong. "I did not mean to inconvenience you," I said. "Well, if you did not suppose you were being impertinent, at least I did. You are a cad, young sir," he shouted in reply. "But what right have you to shout at me like that?" I exclaimed, feeling that it was now he that was insulting me, and growing angry accordingly. "This much right," he replied, "that I never allow myself to be overlooked by any one, and that I always teach young fellows like yourself their manners. What is your name, young sir, and where do you live?" At this I felt so hurt that my teeth chattered, and I felt as though I were choking. Yet all the while I was conscious of being in the wrong, and so, instead of offering any further rudeness to the offended one, humbly told him my name and address. "And my name, young sir," he returned, "is Kolpikoff, and I will trouble you to be more polite to me in future. However, you will hear from me again." "Vous aurez de mes nouvelles" (the conversation had been carried on wholly in French) was his concluding remark. To this I replied, "I shall be delighted," with an infusion of as much hauteur as I could muster into my tone. Then, turning on my heel, I returned with my cigarette, which had meanwhile gone out, to our own room. I said nothing, either to my brother or my friends, about what had happened, and the more so because they were at that moment engaged in a dispute of their own, but sat down in a corner to think over the strange affair. The words, "You are a cad, young sir," vexed me more and more the longer that they sounded in my ears. My tipsiness was gone now, and in considering my conduct during the dispute, the uncomfortable thought came over me that I had behaved like a coward. Yet what right had he to attack me? I reflected. Why did he not simply intimate to me that I was annoying him? After all, it may have been that he was in the wrong. Why, too, when he called me a young cad, did I not say to him, "A cad, my good sir, is one who takes offence"? Or why did I not simply tell him to hold his tongue? That would have been the better course. Or why did I not challenge him to a duel? No, I did none of those things, but swallowed his insults like a wretched coward. Still the words, "You are a cad, young sir," kept sounding in my ears with maddening iteration. "I cannot leave things as they are," I at length decided as I rose to my feet with the fixed intention of returning to the gentleman and saying something outrageous to him, perhaps also of breaking the candelabrum over his head if occasion offered. Yet, though I considered the advisability of this last measure with some pleasure, it was not without a good deal of trepidation that I re-entered the main salon. As luck would have it, M. Kolpikoff was no longer there, but only a waiter engaged in clearing the table. For a moment I felt like telling the waiter the whole story and explaining to him my innocence in the matter, but for some reason or another I thought better of it, and once more returned, in the same hazy condition of mind, to our own room. "What has become of our diplomat?" Dubkoff was just saying. "Upon him now hang the fortunes of Europe." "Oh, leave me alone," I said, turning moodily away. Then, as I paced the room, something made me begin to think that Dubkoff was not altogether a good fellow. There is nothing very much to admire in his eternal jokes and his nickname of diplomat, I reflected. All he thinks about is to win money from Woloda and to go to see his auntie. There is nothing very nice in all that. Besides, everything he says has a touch of blackguardism in it, and he is for ever trying to make people laugh. In my opinion, he is simply stupid when he is not absolutely a brute. I spent about 5 minutes in these reflections, and felt my enmity towards Dubkoff continually increasing. For his part, he took no notice of me, and that angered me the more. I actually felt vexed with Woloda and Dimitri because they went on talking to him. "I tell you what, gentlemen, the diplomat ought to be christened," said Dubkoff suddenly, with a glance and a smile which seemed to me derisive and even treacherous. "Yet, oh Lord, what a poor specimen he is!" "You yourself ought to be christened, and you yourself are a sorry specimen," I retorted with an evil smile, and actually forgetting to address him as thou. In Russian, as in French, the second person singular is the form of speech used between intimate friends. This reply evidently surprised Dubkoff, but he turned away good-humouredly, and went on talking to Woloda and Dimitri. I tried to edge myself into the conversation, but since I felt that I could not keep it up, I soon returned to my corner and remained there until we left. When the bill had been paid and wraps were being put on, Dubkoff turned to Dimitri and said, "Whither are Orestes and Pedalion going now? Home, I suppose, to talk about love. Well, let us go and see my dear auntie. That will be far more entertaining than your sour company." "How dare you speak like that, and laugh at us?" I burst out, as I approached him with clenched fists. "How dare you laugh at feelings which you do not understand? I will not have you do it. Hold your tongue." At this point I had to hold my own, for I did not know what to say next, and was, moreover, out of breath with excitement. At first Dubkoff was taken aback, but presently he tried to laugh it off, and to take it as a joke. Finally, I was surprised to see him look crestfallen, and lower his eyes. "I never laugh at you or your feelings. It is merely my way of speaking," he said evasively. "Indeed!" I cried. Yet the next moment I felt ashamed of myself and sorry for him, since his flushed, downcast face had in it no other expression than one of genuine pain. "What is the matter with you?" said Woloda and Dimitri simultaneously. "No one was trying to insult you." "Yes, he did try to insult me," I replied. "What an extraordinary fellow your brother is!" said Dubkoff to Woloda. At that moment he was passing out of the door, and could not have heard what I said. Possibly I should have flung myself after him and offered him further insult had it not been that just at that moment the waiter who had witnessed my encounter with Kolpikoff handed me my greatcoat, and I at once quietened down, merely making such a pretence of having had a difference with Dimitri as was necessary to make my sudden appeasement appear nothing extraordinary. Next day, when I met Dubkoff at Woloda's, the quarrel was not raked up. Yet he and I still addressed each other as "you," and found it harder than ever to look one another in the face. The remembrance of my scene with Kolpikoff, who, by the way, never sent me de ses nouvelles, either the following day or any day afterwards, remained for years a keen and unpleasant memory. Even so much as 5 years after it happened, I would begin fidgeting and muttering to myself whenever I remembered the unavenged insult, and was fain to comfort myself with the satisfaction of recollecting the sort of young fellow I had shown myself to be in my subsequent affair with Dubkoff. In fact, it was only later still that I began to regard the matter in another light, and both to recall with comic appreciation my passage of arms with Kolpikoff, and to regret the undeserved affront which I had offered my good friend Dubkoff. When, at a later hour on the evening of the dinner, I told Dimitri of my affair with Kolpikoff, whose exterior I described in detail, he was astounded. "That is the very man!" he cried. "Don't you know that this precious Kolpikoff is a known scamp and sharper, as well as, above all things, a coward, and that he was expelled from his regiment by his brother officers because, having had his face slapped, he would not fight? But how came you to let him get away?" he added, with a kindly smile and glance. "Surely he could not have said more to you than he did when he called you a cad?" "No," I admitted with a blush. "Well, it was not right, but there was no great harm done," said Dimitri consolingly. Long afterwards, when thinking the matter over at leisure, I suddenly came to the conclusion that it was quite possible that Kolpikoff took the opportunity of vicariously wiping off upon me the slap in the face which he had once received, just as I myself took the opportunity of vicariously wiping off upon the innocent Dubkoff the epithet "cad" which Kolpikoff had just applied to me. End of Section 4. Recording by Bill Borst. Section 5 of Youth by Leo Tolstoy, translated by C.J. Hogarth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 5, Chapters 17 through 20. Chapter 17. I get ready to pay some calls. On awaking next morning, my first thoughts were of the affair with Kolpikoff. Once again I muttered to myself and stamped about the room, but there was no help for it. To-day was the last day that I was to spend in Moscow, and it was to be spent, by Papa's orders, in my paying a round of calls which he had written out for me on a piece of paper, his first solicitude on our account being not so much for our morals or our education as for our due observance of the convenances. On the piece of paper was written in his swift, broken handwriting, 1. Prince Ivan Ivanovitch, without fail. 2. The Iwins, without fail. 3. Prince Michael. 4. The the Princess Nechludoff and Madame Valakhin, if you wish. Of course I was also to call upon my guardian, upon the rector, and upon the professors. These last mentioned calls, however, Dimitri advised me not to pay, saying that it was not only unnecessary to do so, but not the thing. However, there were the other visits to be got through. It was the first two on the list, those marked as to be paid without fail, that most alarmed me. Prince Ivan Ivanovitch was a commander-in-chief, as well as old, wealthy, and a bachelor. Consequently, I foresaw that vis-à-vis conversation between him and myself a 16-year-old student, was not likely to be interesting. As for the Iwins, they too were rich, the father being a departmental official of high rank who had only on one occasion called at our house during my grandmother's time. Since her death, I had remarked that the younger Iwin had fought shy of us, and seemed to give himself airs. The elder of the pair, I had heard, had now finished his course in jurisprudence, and gone to hold a post in St. Petersburg, while his brother Sergius, the former object of my worship, was also in St. Petersburg, as a great fat cadet in the corps of pages. When I was a young man, not only did I dislike intercourse with people who thought themselves above me, but such intercourse was, for me, an unbearable torture, owing partly to my constant dread of being snubbed, and partly to my straining every faculty of my intellect to prove to such people my independence. Yet, even if I failed to fulfil the latter part of my father's instructions, I felt that I must carry out the former. I paced my room, and eyed my clothes ready disposed on chairs, the tunic, the sword, and the cap. Just as I was about to set forth, old Grap called to congratulate me, bringing with him Ilinka. Grap père was a Russianized German, and an intolerably effusive, sycophantic old man who was more often than not tipsy. As a rule, he visited us only when he wanted to ask for something, and although Papa sometimes entertained him in his study, old Grap never came to dinner with us. With his subserviency and begging propensities went such a faculty of good humour and a power of making himself at home that every one looked upon his attachment to us as a great honour. For my part, however, I never liked him, and felt ashamed when he was speaking. I was much put out by the arrival of these visitors, and made no effort to conceal the fact. Upon Ilinka I had been so used to look down, and he so used to recognize my right to do so, that it displeased me to think that he was now as much a matriculated student as myself. In some way he appeared to me to have made a point of attaining that equality. I greeted the pair coldly, and without offering them any refreshment, since it went against the grain to do so, and I thought they could ask for anything if they wanted it without my first inviting them to state their requirements. Gave orders for the drozhki to be got ready. Ilinka was a good-natured, extremely moral, and far from stupid young fellow, yet for all that, what people call a person of moods. That is to say, for no apparent reason he was for ever in some pronounced frame of mind, now lachrymose, now frivolous, now touchy on the very smallest point. At the present moment he appeared to be in the last-named mood. He kept looking from his father to myself without speaking, except when directly addressed, at which times he smiled the self-deprecatory, forced smile under which he was accustomed to conceal his feelings, and more especially that feeling of shame for his father which he must have experienced in our house. "So, Nicholas Petrovitch," the old man said to me, following me everywhere about the room as I went through the operation of dressing, while all the while his fat fingers kept turning over and over a silver snuff-box with which my grandmother had once presented me, "as soon as ever I heard from my son that you had passed your examinations so well, though of course your abilities are well known to every one, I at once came to congratulate you, my dear boy. Why, I have carried you on my shoulders before now, and God knows that I love you as though you were my own son. My Ilinka, too, has always been fond of you, and feels quite at home with you." Meanwhile the said Ilinka remained sitting silently by the window, apparently absorbed in contemplation of my three-cornered cap, and every now and then angrily muttering something in an undertone. "Now I also wanted to ask you, Nicholas Petrovitch," his father went on, "whether my son did well in the examinations. He tells me that he is going to be in the same faculty as yourself, and that therefore you will be able to keep an eye on him, and advise him, and so on." "Oh, yes, I suppose he passed well," I replied with a glance at Ilinka, who, conscious of my gaze, reddened violently and ceased to move his lips about. "And might he spend the day with you?" was the father's next request, which he made with a deprecatory smile, as though he stood in actual awe of me, yet always keeping so close to me, wherever I moved, that the fumes of the drink and tobacco in which he had been indulging were constantly perceptible to my nostrils. I felt greatly vexed at his placing me in such a false position towards his son, as well as at his distracting my attention from what was, to me, a highly important operation, namely, the operation of dressing. While over and above all, I was annoyed by the smell of liquor with which he followed me about. Accordingly, I said very coldly that I could not have the pleasure of Ilinka's company that day, since I should be out. "Ah, I suppose you are going to see your sister?" put in Ilinka with a smile, but without looking at me. "Well, I too have business to attend to." At this I felt even more put out, as well as pricked with compunction, so, to soften my refusal a little, I hastened to say that the reason why I should not be at home that day was that I had to call upon the Prince Ivan Ivanovitch, the Princess Kornakoff, and the Monsieur Iwin, who held such an influential post, as well as probably to dine with the Princess Nechludoff, for I thought that, on learning what important folk I was in the habit of mixing with, the Grapes would no longer think it worth while to pretend to me. However, just as they were leaving, I invited Ilinka to come and see me another day, but he only murmured something unintelligible, and it was plain that he meant never to set foot in the house again. When they had departed, I set off on my round of calls. Woloda, whom I had asked that morning to come with me, in order that I might not feel quite so shy as when altogether alone, had declined, on the ground that for two brothers to be seen driving in one drozhki would appear so horribly proper. Chapter 18. The Valakhin Family. Accordingly, I set off alone. My first call on the route lay at the Valakhin mansion. It was now 3 years since I had seen Sonetchka, and my love for her had long become a thing of the past. Yet there still lingered in my heart a sort of clear, touching recollection of our bygone, childish affection. At intervals also, during those 3 years, I had found myself recalling her memory with such force and vividness that I had actually shed tears, and imagined myself to be in love with her again. But those occasions had not lasted more than a few minutes at a time, and had been long in recurring. I knew that Sonetchka and her mother had been abroad, that, in fact, they had been so for the last 2 years. Also, I had heard that they had been in a carriage accident, and that Sonetchka's face had been so badly cut with the broken glass that her beauty was marred. As I drove to their house, I kept recalling the old Sonetchka to my mind, and wondering what she would look like when I met her. Somehow I imagined that, after her 2 years' sojourn abroad, she would look very tall, with a beautiful waist, and, though sedate and imposing, extremely attractive. Somehow, also, my imagination refused to picture her with her face disfigured with scars, but, on the contrary, since I had read somewhere of a lover who remained true to his adored one in spite of her disfigurement with smallpox, strove to imagine that I was in love with Sonetchka, for the purpose of priding myself on holding to my troth in spite of her scars. Yet, as a matter of fact, I was not really in love with her during that drive, but, having once stirred up in myself old memories of love, felt prepared to fall into that condition, and the more so because, of late, my conscience had often been pricking me for having discarded so many of my old flames. The Valakhins lived in a neat little wooden mansion approached by a courtyard. I gained admittance by ringing a bell (then a rarity in Moscow), and was received by a mincing, smartly attired page. He either could not, or made no attempt to, inform me whether there was any one at home, but, leaving me alone in the dark hall, ran off down a still darker corridor. For a long time I waited in solitude in this gloomy place, out of which, in addition to the front door and the corridor, there only opened a door which, at the moment, was closed. Rather surprised at the dismal appearance of the house, I came to the conclusion that the reason was that its inmates were still abroad. After 5 minutes, however, the door leading into the salon was opened by the page-boy, who then conducted me into a neat, but not richly furnished, drawing-room, where presently I was joined by Sonetchka. She was now 17 years old, and very small and thin, as well as of an unhealthy pallor of face. No scars at all were visible, however, and the beautiful, prominent eyes and bright, cheerful smile were the same as I had known and loved in my childhood. I had not expected her to look at all like this, and therefore could not at once lavish upon her the sentiment which I had been preparing on the way. She gave me her hand in the English fashion, which was then as much a novelty as a door-bell, and, bestowing upon mine a frank squeeze, sat down on the sofa by my side. "Ah, how glad I am to see you, my dear Nicholas!" she said as she looked me in the face with an expression of pleasure so sincere that in the words "my dear Nicholas" I caught the purely friendly rather than the patronizing note. To my surprise she seemed to me simpler, kinder, and more sisterly after her foreign tour than she had been before it. True, I could now see that she had 2 small scars between her nose and temples, but her wonderful eyes and smile fitted in exactly with my recollections, and shone as of old. "But how greatly you have changed!" she went on. "You are quite grown up now, and well, what do you think of me?" "I should never have known you," I replied, despite the fact that at that moment I was thinking that I should have known her anywhere and always. "Why? Am I grown so ugly?" she inquired with a movement of her head. "Oh, no, decidedly not," I hastened to reply. "But you have grown taller and older. As for being uglier, why, you are even—" "Yes, yes, never mind. Do you remember our dances and games, and St. Jerome and Madame Dorat?" As a matter of fact, I could not recollect any Madame Dorat, but saw that Sonetchka was being led away by the joy of her childish recollections, and mixing them up a little. "Ah, what a lovely time it was!" she went on, and once more there shone before me the same eyes and smile as I had always carried in my memory. While she had been speaking, I had been thinking over my position at the present moment, and had come to the conclusion that I was in love with her. The instant, however, that I arrived at that result, my careless, happy mood vanished. A mist seemed to arise before me which concealed even her eyes and smile, and, blushing hotly, I became tongue-tied and ill at ease. "But times are different now," she went on with a sigh and a little lifting of her eyebrows. "Everything seems worse than it used to be, and ourselves too. Is it not so, Nicholas?" I could return her no answer, but sat silently looking at her. "Where are those Iwins and Kornakoffs now? Do you remember them?" she continued, looking, I think, with some curiosity at my blushing, downcast countenance. "What splendid times we used to have!" Still I could not answer her. The next moment I was relieved from this awkward position by the entry of old Madame Valakhin into the room. Rising, I bowed, and straightway recovered my faculty of speech. On the other hand, an extraordinary change now took place in Sonetchka. All her gaiety and bonhomie disappeared. Her smile became quite a different one, and, except for the point of her shortness of stature, she became just the lady from abroad whom I expected to find in her. Yet for this change there was no apparent reason, since her mother smiled every whit as pleasantly, and expressed in her every movement just the same benignity as of old. Seating herself in her armchair, the old lady signed to me to come and sit beside her, after which she said something to her daughter in English, and Sonetchka left the room, a fact which still further helped to relieve me. Madame then inquired after my father and brother, and passed on to speak of her great bereavement, the loss of her husband. Presently, however, she seemed to become sensible of the fact that I was not helping much in the conversation, for she gave me a look as much as to say, "If now, my dear boy, you were to get up, to take your leave, and to depart, it would be well." But a curious circumstance had overtaken me. While she had been speaking of her bereavement, I had recalled to myself not only the fact that I was in love, but the probability that the mother knew of it, whereupon such a fit of bashfulness had come upon me that I felt powerless to put any member of my body to its legitimate use. I knew that if I were to rise and walk I should have to think where to plant each foot, what to do with my head, what with my hands, and so on. In a word, I foresaw that I should be very much as I had been on the night when I partook too freely of champagne, and therefore, since I felt uncertain of being able to manage myself if I did rise, I ended by feeling unable to rise. Meanwhile, I should say, Sonetchka had returned to the room with her work, and seated herself in a far corner, a corner whence, as I was nevertheless sensible, she could observe me. Madame must have felt some surprise as she gazed at my crimson face and noted my complete immobility, but I decided that it was better to continue sitting in that absurd position than to risk something unpleasant by getting up and walking. Thus I sat on and on, in the hope that some unforeseen chance would deliver me from my predicament. That unforeseen chance at length presented itself in the person of an unforeseen young man, who entered the room with an air of being one of the household, and bowed to me politely as he did so. Whereupon Madame rose, excused herself to me for having to speak with her homme d'affaires, and finally gave me a glance which said, "Well, if you do mean to go on sitting there for ever, at least I can't drive you away." Accordingly, with a great effort, I also rose, but finding it impossible to do any leave-taking, moved away towards the door, followed by the pitying glances of mother and daughter. All at once I stumbled over a chair, although it was lying quite out of my route, the reason for my stumbling being that my whole attention was so centred upon not tripping over the carpet. Driving through the fresh air, however, where I first muttered and fidgeted about so much that Kuzma, my coachman, asked me what was the matter, I soon found this feeling pass away, and began to meditate quietly concerning my love for Sonetchka and her relations with her mother, which had appeared to me rather strange. When, afterwards, I told my father that mother and daughter had not seemed on the best of terms with one another, he said, "Yes, Madame leads the poor girl an awful life with her meanness. Yet," added my father with a greater display of feeling than a man might naturally conceive for a mere relative, "she used to be such an original, dear, charming woman. I cannot think what has made her change so much. By the way, you didn't notice a secretary fellow about, did you? Fancy a Russian lady having an affair with a secretary!" "Yes, I saw him," I replied. "And was he at least good-looking?" "No, not at all." "It is extraordinary," concluded Papa, with a cough and an irritable hoist of his shoulder. "Well, I am in love," was my secret thought to myself as I drove along in my drozhki. Chapter 19. The Kornakoffs. My second call on the route lay at the Kornakoffs, who lived on the first floor of a large mansion facing the Arbat. The staircase of the building looked extremely neat and orderly, yet in no way luxurious, being lined only with drugget pinned down with highly polished brass rods. Nowhere were there any flowers or mirrors to be seen. The salon, too, with its polished floor, which I traversed on my way to the drawing-room, was decorated in the same cold, severe, unostentatious style. Everything in it looked bright and solid, but not new, and pictures, flower-stands, and articles of bric-a-brac were wholly absent. In the drawing-room I found some of the young princesses seated, but seated with a sort of correct company air about them which gave one the impression that they sat like that only when guests were expected. "Mamma will be here presently," the eldest of them said to me as she seated herself by my side. For the next quarter of an hour this young lady entertained me with such an easy flow of small talk that the conversation never flagged a moment. Yet somehow she made so patent the fact that she was just entertaining me that I felt not altogether pleased. Amongst other things, she told me that their brother Stephen, whom they called Etienne, and who had been 2 years at the College of Cadets, had now received his commission. Whenever she spoke of him, and more particularly when she told me that he had flouted his mother's wishes by entering the Hussars, she assumed a nervous air, and immediately her sisters, sitting there in silence, also assumed a nervous air. When, again, she spoke of my grandmother's death, she assumed a mournful air, and immediately the others all did the same. Finally, when she recalled how I had once struck St. Jerome and been expelled from the room, she laughed and showed her bad teeth, and immediately all the other princesses laughed and showed their bad teeth too. Next, the Princess Mother herself entered, a little dried-up woman with a wandering glance and a habit of always looking at somebody else when she was addressing one. Taking my hand, she raised her own to my lips for me to kiss it, which, otherwise, not supposing it to be necessary, I should not have done. "How pleased I am to see you!" she said with her usual clearness of articulation as she gazed at her daughters. "And how like your mother you look! Does he not, Lise?" Lise assented, though I knew for a fact that I did not resemble my mother in the least. "And what a grown-up you have become! My Etienne, you will remember, is your second cousin. No, not second cousin. What is it, Lise?" "My mother was Barbara Dimitrievna, daughter of Dimitri Nikolaevitch, and your grandmother was Natalia Nikolaevna." "Then he is our third cousin, Mamma," said the eldest girl. "Oh, how you always confuse me!" was her mother's angry reply. Not third cousin, but cousin german. That is your relationship to Etienne. He is an officer now. Did you know it? It is not well that he should have his own way too much. You young men need keeping in hand, or— Well, you are not vexed because your old aunt tells you the plain truth? I always kept Etienne strictly in hand, for I found it necessary to do so. Yes, that is how our relationship stands," she went on. "Prince Ivan Ivanovitch is my uncle, and your late mother's uncle also. Consequently, I must have been your mother's first cousin— no, second cousin. Yes, that is it. Tell me, have you been to call on Prince Ivan yet?" I said no, but that I was just going to. "Ah, is it possible?" she cried. "Why, you ought to have paid him the first call of all. Surely you know that he stands to you in the position of a father? He has no children of his own, and his only heirs are yourself and my children. You ought to pay him all possible deference, both because of his age, and because of his position in the world, and because of everything else. I know that you young fellows of the present day think nothing of relationships, and are not fond of old men. Yet do you listen to me, your old aunt, for I am fond of you, and was fond of your mother, and had a very great liking and respect for your grandmother. You must not fail to call upon him on any account." I said that I would certainly go, and since my present call seemed to me to have lasted long enough, I rose, and was about to depart, but she restrained me. "No, wait a minute," she cried. "Where is your father, Lise? Go and tell him to come here. He will be so glad to see you," she added, turning to me. 2 minutes later Prince Michael entered. He was a short, thick-set gentleman, very slovenly dressed and ill-shaven, yet wearing such an air of indifference that he looked almost a fool. He was not in the least glad to see me. At all events, he did not intimate that he was. But the Princess, who appeared to stand in considerable awe of him, hastened to say— "Is not Woldemar here?" She seemed to have forgotten my name. "Exactly like his mother?" And she gave her husband a glance which forced him to guess what she wanted. Accordingly he approached me with his usual passionless, half-discontented expression, and held out to me an unshaven cheek to kiss. "Why, you are not dressed yet, though you have to go out soon," was the Princess's next remark to him in the angry tone which she habitually employed in conversation with her domestics. "It will only mean your offending some one again, and trying to set people against you." In a moment, mother," said Prince Michael, and departed. I also made my bows, and departed. This was the first time I had heard of our being related to Prince Ivan Ivanovitch, and the news struck me unpleasantly. Chapter 20. The Iwins. As for the prospect of my call upon the Prince, it seemed even more unpleasant. However, the order of my route took me first to the Iwins, who lived in a large and splendid mansion in Tverskaya Street. It was not without some nervousness that I entered the great portico, where a Swiss major-domo stood armed with his staff of office. To my inquiry as to whether any one was at home, he replied, "Whom do you wish to see, sir? The General's son is within." "And the General himself?" I asked with forced assurance. "I must report to him your business first. What may it be, sir?" said the major-domo as he rang a bell. Immediately the gaitered legs of a footman showed themselves on the staircase above, whereupon I was seized with such a fit of nervousness that I hastily bid the lacquey say nothing about my presence to the General, since I would first see his son. By the time I had reached the top of the long staircase, I seemed to have grown extremely small, metaphorically, I mean, not actually, and had very much the same feeling within me as had possessed my soul when my droshky drew up to the great portico, namely, a feeling as though droshky, horse, and coachman had all of them grown extremely small too. I found the General's son lying asleep on a sofa, with an open book before him. His tutor, Monsieur Frost, under whose care he still pursued his studies at home, had entered behind me with a sort of boyish tread, and now awoke his pupil. Iwin evinced no particular pleasure at seeing me, while I also seemed to notice that, while talking to me, he kept looking at my eyebrows. Although he was perfectly polite, I conceived that he was entertaining me much as the Princess Valakhin had done, and that he not only felt no particular liking for me, but even that he considered my acquaintance in no way necessary to one who possessed his own circle of friends. All this arose out of the idea that he was regarding my eyebrows. In short, his bearing towards me appeared to be, as I recognized with an awkward sensation, very much the same as my own towards Alinka Grap. I began to feel irritated, and to interpret every fleeting glance which he cast at Monsieur Frost as a mute inquiry. "Why has this fellow come to see me?" After some conversation, he remarked that his father and mother were at home. Would I not like to visit them too? "First I will go and dress myself," he added as he departed to another room, notwithstanding that he had seemed to be perfectly well dressed in a new frock-coat and white waistcoat in the present one. A few minutes later he reappeared in his University uniform, buttoned up to the chin, and we went downstairs together. The reception-rooms through which we passed were lofty and of great size, and seemed to be richly furnished with marble and gilt ornaments, chintz-covered settees, and a number of mirrors. Presently Madame Iwin met us, and we went into a little room behind the drawing-room, where, welcoming me in very friendly fashion, she seated herself by my side, and began to inquire after my relations. Closer acquaintance with Madame, whom I had seen only twice before, and that but for a moment on each occasion, impressed me favourably. She was tall, thin, and very pale, and looked as though she suffered from chronic depression and fatigue. Yet, though her smile was a sad one, it was very kind, and her large, mournful eyes, with a slight cast in their vision, added to the pathos and attractiveness of her expression. Her attitude, while not precisely that of a hunchback, made her whole form droop, while her every movement expressed languor. Likewise, though her speech was deliberate, the timbre of her voice, and the manner in which she lisped her r's and l's, were very pleasing to the ear. Finally, she did not entertain me. Unfortunately, the answers which I returned to her questions concerning my relations seemed to afford her a painful interest, and to remind her of happier days, with the result that when presently her son left the room, she gazed at me in silence for a moment, and then burst into tears. As I sat there in mute bewilderment, I could not conceive what I had said to bring this about. At first I felt sorry for her as she sat there weeping with downcast eyes. Next I began to think to myself, ought I not try to comfort her, and how ought that to be done? Finally, I began to feel vexed with her for placing me in such an awkward position. Surely my appearance is not so moving as all that, I reflected. Or is she merely acting like this to see what I shall do under the circumstances? Yet it would not do for me to go, I continued to myself, for that would look too much as though I were fleeing to escape her tears. Accordingly, I began fidgeting about on my seat, in order to remind her of my presence. "Oh, how foolish of me!" at length she said, as she gazed at me for a moment and tried to smile. "There are days when one weeps for no reason whatever." She felt about for her handkerchief, and then burst out weeping more violently than before. "Oh dear! How silly of me to be for ever crying like this! Yet I was so fond of your mother. We were such friends. We were—" At this point she found her handkerchief, and, burying her face in it, went on crying. Once more I found myself in the same protracted dilemma. Though vexed, I felt sorry for her, since her tears appeared to be genuine, even though I also had the idea that it was not so much for my mother that she was weeping as for the fact that she was unhappy, and had known happier days. How it would all have ended I do not know, had not her son reappeared and said that his father desired to see her. Thereupon she rose, and was just about to leave the room, when the General himself entered. He was a small, grizzled, thick-set man, with bushy black eyebrows, a grey, close-cropped head, and a very stern, haughty expression of countenance. I rose and bowed to him, but the General, who was wearing 3 stars on his green frock-coat, not only made no response to my salutation, but scarcely even looked at me, so that all at once I felt as though I were not a human being at all, but only some negligible object such as a settee or a window, or, if I were a human being, as though I were quite indistinguishable from such a negligible object. "Then you have not yet written to the Countess, my dear?" he said to his wife in French, and with an imperturbable yet determined expression on his countenance. "Good-bye, Monsieur Urtenieff," Madame said to me, in her turn, as she made a proud gesture with her head and looked at my eyebrows, just as her son had done. I bowed to her, and again to her husband, but my second salutation made no more impression upon him than if a window had just been opened or closed. Nevertheless, the younger Iwin accompanied me to the door, and on the way told me that he was to go to St. Petersburg University, since his father had been appointed to a post in that city, and young Iwin named a very high office in the service. "Well, his Papa may do whatever he likes," I muttered to myself as I climbed into the drozhki, "but at all events I will never set foot in that house again. His wife weeps and looks at me as though I were the embodiment of woe, while that old pig of a General does not even give me a bow. However, I will get even with him some day." How I meant to do that I do not know, but my words nevertheless came true. Afterwards, I frequently found it necessary to remember the advice of my father when he said that I must cultivate the acquaintanceship of the Iwins, and not expect a man in the position of General Iwin to pay any attention to a boy like myself. But I had figured in that position long enough. End of Section 5. Recording by Bill Borst. Section 6 of Youth by Leo Tolstoy, translated by C.J. Hogarth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 6, Chapters 21 through 24. Chapter 21. Prince Ivan Ivanovitch. "Now for the last call, the visit to Nikitskaya Street," I said to Kuzma, and we started for Prince Ivan Ivanovitch's mansion. Towards the end, a round of calls usually brings one a certain amount of self-assurance. Consequently, I was approaching the Prince's abode in quite a tranquil frame of mind, when suddenly I remembered the Princess Kornakoff's words that I was his heir, and at the same moment caught sight of 2 carriages waiting at the portico. Instantly my former nervousness returned. Both the old major domo who opened the door to me, and the footman who took my coat, and the 2 male and 3 female visitors whom I found in the drawing-room, and most of all Prince Ivan Ivanovitch himself, whom I found clad in a company frock-coat and seated on a sofa, seemed to look at me as an heir, and so to eye me with ill-will. Yet the Prince was very gracious, and after kissing me, that is to say, after pressing his cold, dry, flabby lips to my cheek for a second, asked me about my plans and pursuits, jested with me, inquired whether I still wrote verses of the kind which I used to indite in honour of my grandmother's birthdays, and invited me to dine with him that day. Nevertheless, in proportion as he grew the kinder, the more did I feel persuaded that his civility was only intended to conceal from me the fact that he disliked the idea of my being his heir. He had a custom, due to his false teeth, of which his mouth possessed a complete set, of raising his upper lip a little as he spoke, and producing a slight whistling sound from it. And whenever, on the present occasion, he did so, it seemed to me that he was saying to himself, "A boy, a boy! I know it! And my heir, too! My heir!" When we were children, we had been used to calling the Prince "dear uncle," but now, in my capacity of heir, I could not bring my tongue to the phrase, while to say "Your Highness," as did one of the other visitors, seemed derogatory to my self-esteem. Consequently, never once during that visit did I call him anything at all. The personage, however, who most disturbed me was the old Princess who shared with me the position of prospective inheritor, and who lived in the Prince's house. While seated beside her at dinner, I felt firmly persuaded that the reason why she would not speak to me was that she disliked me for being her co-heir, and that the Prince, for his part, paid no attention to our side of the table for the reason that the Princess and myself hoped to succeed him, and so were alike distasteful in his sight. "You cannot think how I hated it all," I said to Dmitrieff the same evening, in a desire to make a parade of disliking the notion of being an heir. Somehow I thought it the thing to do. "You cannot think how I loathed the whole 2 hours that I spent there. Yet he is a fine-looking old fellow, and was very kind to me," I added, wishing among other things to disabuse my friend of any possible idea that my loathing had arisen out of the fact that I had felt so small. "It is only the idea that people may be classing me with the Princess who lives with him, and who licks the dust off his boots. He is a wonderful old man, and good and considerate to everybody, but it is awful to see how he treats the Princess. Money is a detestable thing, and ruins all human relations. Do you know, I think it would be far the best thing for me to have an open explanation with the Prince. I went on, "to tell him that I respect him as a man, but think nothing of being his heir, and that I desire him to leave me nothing, since that is the only condition on which I can, in future, visit his house." Instead of bursting out laughing when I said this, Dimitri pondered a while in silence, and then answered: "You are wrong. Either you ought to refrain from supposing that people may be classing you with this Prince's of whom you speak, or, if you do suppose such a thing, you ought to suppose further that people are thinking what you yourself know quite well, namely, that such thoughts are so utterly foreign to your nature that you despise them and would never make them a basis for action. Suppose, however, that people do suppose you to suppose such a thing. Well, to sum up," he added, feeling that he was getting a little mixed in his pronouncements, "you had much better not suppose anything of the kind." My friend was perfectly right, though it was not until long, long afterwards that experience of life taught me the evil that comes of thinking, still worse, of saying, much that seems very fine; taught me that there are certain thoughts which should always be kept to oneself, since brave words seldom go with brave deeds. I learnt then that the mere fact of giving utterance to a good intention often makes it difficult, nay, impossible, to carry that good intention into effect. Yet how is one to refrain from giving utterance to the brave, self-sufficient impulses of youth? Only long afterwards does one remember and regret them, even as one incontinently plucks a flower before its blooming, and subsequently finds it lying crushed and withered on the ground. The very next morning, I, who had just been telling my friend Dimitri that money corrupts all human relations, and had, as we have seen, squandered the whole of my cash on pictures and Turkish pipes, accepted a loan of 20 roubles, which he suggested should pay for my travelling expenses into the country, and remained a long while thereafter in his debt. Chapter 22. Intimate Conversation with my Friend. This conversation of ours took place in a phaeton on the way to Kuntsevo. Dimitri had invited me in the morning to go with him to his mother's, and had called for me after luncheon, the idea being that I should spend the evening, and perhaps also pass the night, at the country house where his family lived. Only when we had left the city and exchanged its grimy streets and the unbearably deafening clatter of its pavements for the open vista of fields and the subdued grinding of carriage wheels on a dusty high road, while the sweet spring air and prospect enveloped us on every side, did I awake from the new impressions and sensations of freedom into which the past 2 days had plunged me. Dimitri was in his kind and sociable mood. That is to say, he was neither frowning nor blinking nervously nor straightening his neck in his collar. For my own part, I was congratulating myself on those noble sentiments which I have expressed above, in the belief that they had led him to overlook my shameful encounter with Kolpikoff, and to refrain from despising me for it. Thus we talked together on many an intimate subject which even a friend seldom mentions to a friend. He told me about his family whose acquaintance I had not yet made, about his mother, his aunt, and his sister, as also about her whom Woloda and Dubkoff believed to be his "flame," and always spoke of as the lady with the chestnut locks. Of his mother he spoke with a certain cold and formal commendation, as though to forestall any further mention of her. His aunt he extolled enthusiastically, though with a touch of condescension in his tone. His sister he scarcely mentioned at all, as though averse to doing so in my presence. But on the subject of the lady with the chestnut locks, whose real name was Lubov Sergievna, and who was a grown-up young lady living on a family footing with the Nechludoffs, he discoursed with animation. "Yes, she is a wonderful woman," he said with a conscious reddening of the face, yet looking me in the eyes with dogged temerity. "True, she is no longer young, and even rather elderly, as well as by no means good-looking. But as for loving a mere featherhead, a mere beauty, well, I never could understand that, for it is such a silly thing to do." Dimitri said this as though he had just discovered a most novel and extraordinary truth. I am certain, too, that such a soul, such a heart and principles as are hers, are not to be found elsewhere in the world of the present day. I do not know whence he had derived the habit of saying that few good things were discoverable in the world of the present day, but at all events he loved to repeat the expression, and it somehow suited him. "Only, I am afraid," he went on quietly, after thus annihilating all such men as were foolish enough to admire mere beauty, "I am afraid that you will not understand or realize her quickly. She is modest, even secretive, and by no means fond of exhibiting her beautiful and surprising qualities. Now my mother, who, as you will see, is a noble, sensible woman, has known Lubov Sergievna for many years, yet even to this day she does not properly understand her. Shall I tell you why I was out of temper last evening when you were questioning me? Well, you must know that the day before yesterday Lubov asked me to accompany her to Ivan Yakovlevitch's. You have heard of him, I suppose, the fellow who seems to be mad, but who in reality is a very remarkable man? Well, Lubov is extremely religious, and understands Ivan Yakovlevitch to the full. She often goes to see him, and converses with him, and gives him money for the poor, money which she has earned herself. She is a marvellous woman, as you will see. Well, I went with her to Ivan's, and felt very grateful to her for having afforded me the opportunity of exchanging a word with so remarkable a man. But my mother could not understand our action at all, and discerned in it only superstition. Consequently, last night she and I quarrelled for the first time in our lives. A very bitter one it was, too," he concluded with a convulsive shrug of his shoulders, as though the mention of it recalled the feelings which he had then experienced. "And what are your intentions about it all?" I inquired, to divert him from such a disagreeable recollection. "That is to say, how do you imagine it is going to turn out? Do you ever speak to her about the future, or about how your love or friendship are going to end?" "Do you mean, do I intend to marry her eventually?" he inquired, in his turn, with a renewed blush, but turning himself round and looking me boldly in the face. "Yes, certainly," I replied, as I settled myself down. "We are both of us grown up, as well as friends, so we may as well discuss our future life as we drive along. No one could very well overlook or overhear us now." "Why should I not marry her?" he went on in response to my reassuring reply. "It is my aim, as it should be the aim of every honourable man, to be as good and as happy as possible. And with her, if she should still be willing when I have become more independent, I should be happier and better than with the greatest beauty in the world." Absorbed in such conversation, we hardly noticed that we were approaching Kuntsevo, or that the sky was becoming overcast and beginning to threaten rain. On the right, the sun was slowly sinking behind the ancient trees of the Kuntsevo Park, one half of its brilliant disc obscured with grey, subluminous cloud, and the other half sending forth spokes of flaming light which threw the old trees into striking relief as they stood there with their dense crowns of green showing against a blue patch of sky. The light and shimmer of that patch contrasted sharply with the heavy pink cloud which lay massed above a young birch-tree visible on the horizon before us, while a little further to the right the parti-coloured roofs of the Kuntsevo mansion could be seen projecting above a belt of trees and undergrowth, one side of them reflecting the glittering rays of the sun, and the other side harmonizing with the more lowering portion of the heavens. Below us, and to the left, showed the still blue of a pond where it lay surrounded with pale green laburnums, its dull, concave-looking depths repeating the trees in more sombre shades of colour over the surface of a hillock. Beyond the water spread the black expanse of a ploughed field, with the straight line of a dark green ridge by which it was bisected running far into the distance, and there joining the leaden, threatening horizon. On either side of the soft road along which the phaeton was pursuing the even tenor of its way, bright green, tangled, juicy belts of rye were sprouting here and there into stalk. Not a motion was perceptible in the air, only a sweet freshness, and everything looked extraordinarily clear and bright. Near the road I could see a little brown path winding its way among the dark green, quarter-grown stems of rye, and somehow that path reminded me vividly of our village, and somehow, through some connection of thought, the idea of that village reminded me vividly of Sonetchka, and so of the fact that I was in love with her. Notwithstanding my fondness for Dimitri and the pleasure which his frankness had afforded me, I now felt as though I desired to hear no more about his feelings and intentions with regard to Lubov Sergievna, but to talk unstintedly about my own love for Sonetchka, who seemed to me an object of affection of a far higher order. Yet for some reason or another I could not make up my mind to tell him straight out how splendid it would seem, when I had married Sonetchka and we were living in the country, of how we should have little children who would crawl about the floor and call me Papa, and of how delighted I should be when he, Dimitri, brought his wife, Lubov Sergievna, to see us, wearing an expensive gown. Accordingly, instead of saying all that, I pointed to the setting sun, and merely remarked, "Look, Dimitri, how splendid!" To this, however, Dimitri made no reply, since he was evidently dissatisfied at my answering his confession (which it had cost him so much to make) by directing his attention to natural objects, to which he was in general indifferent. Upon him nature had an effect altogether different to what she had upon myself, for she affected him rather by her industry than by her beauty. He loved her rather with his intellect than with his senses. "I am absolutely happy," I went on, without noticing that he was altogether taken up with his own thoughts and oblivious of anything that I might be saying. "You will remember how I told you about a girl with whom I used to be in love when I was a little boy? Well, I saw her again only this morning, and am now infatuated with her." Then I told him, despite his continued expression of indifference, about my love, and about all my plans for my future connubial happiness. Strangely enough, no sooner had I related in detail the whole strength of my feelings than I instantly became conscious of its diminution. The rain overtook us just as we were turning into the avenue of birch-trees which led to the house, but it did not really wet us. I only knew that it was raining by the fact that I felt a drop fall, first on my nose and then on my hand, and heard something begin to patter upon the young, viscous leaves of the birch-trees, as, drooping their curly branches overhead, they seemed to imbibe the pure, shining drops with an avidity which filled the whole avenue with scent. We descended from the carriage, so as to reach the house the quicker through the garden, but found ourselves confronted at the entrance door by 4 ladies, 2 of whom were knitting, 1 reading a book, and the 4th walking to and fro with a little dog. Thereupon Dimitri began to present me to his mother, sister, and aunt, as well as to Lubov Sergievna. For a moment they remained where they were, but almost instantly the rain became heavier. "Let us go into the verandah. You can present him to us there," said the lady whom I took to be Dimitri's mother, and we all of us ascended the entrance steps. Chapter 23. The Nechludoffs. From the first, the member of this company who struck me the most was Lubov Sergievna, who, holding a lap-dog in her arms and wearing stout-laced boots, was the last of the 4 ladies to ascend the staircase, and twice stopped to gaze at me intently and then kiss her little dog. She was anything but good-looking, since she was red-haired, thin, short, and slightly crooked. What made her plain face all the plainer was the queer way in which her hair was parted to one side. It looked like the wigs which bald women contrive for themselves. However much I should have liked to applaud my friend, I could not find a single comely feature in her. Even her brown eyes, though expressive of good humour, were small and dull, were, in fact, anything but pretty; while her hands, those most characteristic of features, were, though neither large nor ill-shaped, coarse and red. As soon as we reached the verandah, each of the ladies, except Dimitri's sister Varenika, who also had been regarding me attentively out of her large, dark grey eyes, said a few words to me before resuming her occupation, while Varenika herself began to read aloud from a book which she held on her lap and steadied with her finger. The Princess Maria Ivanovna was a tall, well-built woman of 40. To judge by the curls of half-grey hair which descended below her cap, one might have taken her for more, but as soon as ever one observed the fresh, extraordinarily tender, and almost wrinkleless face, as well as, most of all, the lively, cheerful sparkle of the large eyes, one involuntarily took her for less. Her eyes were black and very frank, her lips thin and slightly severe, her nose regular and slightly inclined to the left, and her hands ringless, large, and almost like those of a man, but with finely tapering fingers. She wore a dark blue dress, fastened to the throat, and sitting closely to her firm, still youthful waist. a waist which she evidently pinched. Lastly, she held herself very upright, and was knitting a garment of some kind. As soon as I stepped on to the verandah she took me by the hand, drew me to her as though wishing to scrutinize me more closely, and said, as she gazed at me with the same cold, candid glance as her son's, that she had long known me by report from Dimitri, and that therefore, in order to make my acquaintance thoroughly, she had invited me to stay these 24 hours in her house. "Do just as you please here," she said, "and stand on no ceremony whatever with us, even as we shall stand on none with you. Pray, walk, read, listen, or sleep, as the mood may take you." Sophia Ivanovna was an old maid, and the Princess's younger sister, though she looked the elder of the two. She had that exceedingly overstuffed appearance which old maids always present who are short of stature but wear corsets. It seemed as though her healthiness had shifted upwards to the point of choking her. Her short fat hands would not meet below her projecting bust, and the line of her waist was scarcely visible at all. Notwithstanding that the Princess Maria Ivanovna had black hair and eyes, while Sophia Ivanovna had white hair and large, vivacious, tranquilly blue eyes, a rare combination, there was a great likeness between the two sisters, for they had the same expression, nose, and lips. The only difference was that Sophia's nose and lips were a trifle coarser than Maria's, and that when she smiled, those features inclined towards the right, whereas Maria's inclined towards the left. Sophia, to judge by her dress and coiffure, was still youthful at heart, and would never have displayed grey curls, even if she had possessed them. Yet at first her glance and bearing towards me seemed very proud, and made me nervous, whereas I at once felt at home with the Princess. Perhaps it was only Sophia's stoutness and a certain resemblance to portraits of Catherine the Great that gave her, in my eyes, a haughty aspect, but at all events I felt quite intimidated when she looked at me intently and said, "Friends of our friends are our friends also." I became reassured, and changed my opinion about her only when, after saying those words, she opened her mouth and sighed deeply. It may be that she owed her habit of sighing after every few words, with a great distension of the mouth and a slight drooping of her large blue eyes, to her stoutness, yet it was none the less one which expressed so much good humour that I at once lost all fear of her, and found her actually attractive. Her eyes were charming, her voice pleasant and musical, and even the flowing lines of her fullness seemed to my youthful vision not wholly lacking in beauty. I had imagined that Lubov Sergievna, as my friend's friend, would at once say something friendly and familiar to me. Yet, after gazing at me fixedly for a while, as though in doubt whether the remark she was about to make to me would not be too friendly, she at length asked me what faculty I was in. After that she stared at me as before, in evident hesitation as to whether or not to say something civil and familiar, until, remarking her perplexity, I besought her with a look to speak freely. Yet all she then said was, "They tell me the universities pay very little attention to science now," and turned away to call her little dog. All that evening she spoke only in disjointed fragments of this kind, fragments which had no connection either with the point or with one another. Yet I had such faith in Dimitri, and he so often kept looking from her to me with an expression which mutely asked me, "Now what do you think of that?" that, though I entirely failed to persuade myself that in Lubov Sergievna there was anything to speak of, I could not bear to express the thought even to myself. As for the last member of the family, Varenika, she was a well-developed girl of 16. The only good features in her were a pair of dark grey eyes, which, in their expression of gaiety mingled with quiet attention, greatly resembled those of her aunt, a long coil of flaxen hair, and extremely delicate, beautiful hands. "I expect, Monsieur Nicholas, you will find it wearisome to hear a story begun from the middle?" said Sophia Ivanovna with her good-natured sigh as she turned over some pieces of clothing which she was sewing. The reading aloud had ceased for the moment because Dimitri had left the room on some errand or another. "Or perhaps you have read Rob Roy before?" she added. At that period I thought it incumbent upon me, in virtue of my student's uniform, to reply in a very clever and original manner to every question put to me by people whom I did not know very well, and regarded such short, clear answers as "Yes," "No," I like it, or I do not care for it, as things to be ashamed of. Accordingly, looking down at my new and fashionably cut trousers and the glittering buttons on my tunic, I replied that I had never read Rob Roy, but that it interested me greatly to hear it, since I preferred to read books from the middle rather than from the beginning. "It is twice interesting," I added with a self-satisfied smirk, "for then one can guess what has gone before as well as what is to come after." The Princess smiled, what I thought was a forced smile, but one which I discovered later to be her only one. "Well, perhaps that is true," she said. "But tell me, Nicholas, you will not be offended if I drop the monsieur, tell me, are you going to be in town long? When do you go away?" "I do not know, quite. Perhaps tomorrow, or perhaps not for some while yet," I replied for some reason or another, though I knew perfectly well that in reality we were to go tomorrow. "I wish you could stop longer, both for your own sake and for Dimitri's," she said in a meditative manner. "At your age friendship is a weak thing." I felt that every one was looking at me, and waiting to see what I should say, though certainly Varenika made a pretence of looking at her aunt's work. I felt, in fact, as though I were being put through an examination, and that it behoved me to figure in it as well as possible. "Yes, to me Dimitri's friendship is most useful," I replied, "but to him mine cannot be of any use at all, since he is 1,000 times better than I." Dimitri could not hear what I said, or I should have feared his detecting the insincerity of my words. Again the Princess smiled her unnatural, yet characteristically natural smile. "Just listen to him," she said. "But it is you who are the little monster of perfection." "Monster of perfection," I thought to myself. "That is splendid. I must make a note of it. Yet, to dismiss yourself, he has been extraordinarily clever in that quarter," she went on in a lower tone, which pleased me somehow, as she indicated Lubov Sergievna with her eyes, "since he has discovered in our poor little Auntie" (such was the pet name which they gave Lubov) "all sorts of perfections which I, who have known her and her little dog for 20 years, had never suspected. Varenika, go and tell them to bring me a glass of water," she added, letting her eyes wander again. Probably she had bethought her that it was too soon, or not entirely necessary, to let me into all the family secrets. "Yet no! Let him go, for he has nothing to do, while you are reading." "Pray go to the door, my friend," she said to me, "and walk about 15 steps down the passage. Then halt and call out pretty loudly, 'Peter, bring Maria Ivanovna a glass of iced water.'" And she smiled her curious smile once more. "I expect she wants to say something about me in my absence," I thought to myself as I left the room. "I expect she wants to remark that she can see very clearly that I am a very, very clever young man." Hardly had I taken a dozen steps when I was overtaken by Sophia Ivanovna, who, though fat and short of breath, trod with surprising lightness and agility. "Merci, mon cher," she said. "I will go and tell them myself." Chapter 24. Love. Sophia Ivanovna, as I afterwards came to know her, was one of those rare young old women who are born for family life, but to whom that happiness has been denied by fate. Consequently, all that store of their love which should have been poured out upon a husband and children becomes pent up in their hearts until they suddenly decide to let it overflow upon a few chosen individuals. Yet so inexhaustible is that store of old maids' love that, despite the number of individuals so selected, there remains an abundant surplus of affection which they lavish upon all by whom they are surrounded, upon all, good or bad, whom they may chance to meet in their daily life. Of love there are 3 kinds: love of beauty, the love which denies itself, and practical love. Of the desire of a young man for a young woman, as well as of the reverse instance, I am now speaking, for of such tendresses I am wary, seeing that I have been too unhappy in my life to have been able ever to see in such affection a single spark of truth, but rather a lying pretence, in which sensuality, connubial relations, money, and the wish to bind hands or to unloose them have rendered feeling such a complex affair as to defy analysis. Rather, I am speaking of that love for a human being which, according to the spiritual strength of its possessor, concentrates itself either upon a single individual, upon a few, or upon many. of love for a mother, a father, a brother, little children, a friend, a compatriot, of love, in short, for one's neighbor. Love of beauty consists in a love of the sense of beauty and of its expression. People who thus love conceive the object of their affection to be desirable only in so far as it arouses in them that pleasurable sensation of which the consciousness and the expression soothes the senses. They change the object of their love frequently, since their principal aim consists in ensuring that the voluptuous feeling of their adoration shall be constantly titillated. To preserve in themselves this sensuous condition, they talk unceasingly, and in the most elegant terms, on the subject of the love which they feel, not only for its immediate object, but also for objects upon which it does not touch at all. This country of ours contains many such individuals of that well-known class who, cultivating the beautiful, not only discourse of their cult to all and sundry, but speak of it preeminently in French. It may seem a strange and ridiculous thing to say, but I am convinced that among us we have had in the past, and still have, a large section of society, notably women, whose love for their friends, husbands, or children would expire tomorrow if they were debarred from dilating upon it in the tongue of France. Love of the second kind, renunciatory love, consists in a yearning to undergo self-sacrifice for the object beloved, regardless of any consideration whether such self-sacrifice will benefit or injure the object in question. There is no evil which I would not endure to show both the world and him or her whom I adore my devotion. There we have the formula of this kind of love. People who thus love never look for reciprocity of affection, since it is a finer thing to sacrifice yourself for one who does not comprehend you. They are always painfully eager to exaggerate the merits of their sacrifice, usually constant in their love, for the reason that they would find it hard to forego the kudos of the deprivations which they endure for the object beloved, always ready to die, to prove to him or her the entirety of their devotion, but sparing of such small daily proofs of their love as call for no special effort of self-immolation. They do not much care whether you eat well, sleep well, keep your spirits up, or enjoy good health, nor do they ever do anything to obtain for you those blessings, if they have it in their power, but, should you be confronting a bullet, or have fallen into the water, or stand in danger of being burnt, or have had your heart broken in a love affair, well, for all these things they are prepared if the occasion should arise. Moreover, people addicted to love of such a self-sacrificing order are invariably proud of their love, exacting, jealous, distrustful, and, strange to tell, anxious that the object of their adoration should incur perils, so that they may save it from calamity and console it thereafter, and even be vicious, so that they may purge it of its vice. Suppose, now, that you are living in the country with a wife who loves you in this self-sacrificing manner. You may be healthy and contented and have occupations which interest you, while on the other hand your wife may be too weak to superintend the household work, which in consequence will be left to the servants, or to look after the children, who in consequence will be left to the nurses, or to put her heart into any work whatsoever, and all because she loves nobody and nothing but yourself. She may be patently ill, yet she will say not a word to you about it for fear of distressing you. She may be patently ennuyée, yet for your sake she will be prepared to be so for the rest of her life. She may be patently depressed because you stick so persistently to your occupations, whether sport, books, farming, state, service, or anything else, and see clearly that they are doing you harm, yet for all that she will keep silence and suffer it to be so. Yet, should you but fall sick, and despite her own ailments and your prayers that she will not distress herself in vain, your loving wife will remain sitting inseparably by your bedside. Every moment you will feel her sympathetic gaze resting upon you, and, as it were, saying, "There, I told you so, but it is all one to me, and I shall not leave you." In the morning you may be a little better, and move into another room. The room, however, will be insufficiently warmed or set in order. The soup which alone you feel you could eat will not have been cooked, nor will any medicine have been sent for. Yet, Though worn out with night watching, your loving wife will continue to regard you with an expression of sympathy, to walk about on tiptoe, and to whisper unaccustomed and obscure orders to the servants. You may wish to be read to, and your loving wife will tell you with a sigh that she feels sure you will be unable to hear her reading, and only grow angry at her awkwardness in doing it, wherefore you would better not be read to at all. You may wish to walk about the room, and she will tell you that it would be far better for you not to do so. You may wish to talk with some friends who have called, and she will tell you that talking is not good for you. At nightfall, the fever may come upon you again, and you may wish to be left alone, whereupon your loving wife, though wasted, pale, and full of yawns, will go on sitting in a chair opposite you as dusk falls, until her very slightest movement, her very slightest sound, rouses you to feelings of anger and impatience. You may have a servant who has lived with you for 20 years, and to whom you are attached, and who would tend you well, and to your satisfaction during the night, for the reason that he has been asleep all day, and is, moreover, paid a salary for his services. Yet your wife will not suffer him to wait upon you. No, everything she must do herself with her weak, unaccustomed fingers, of which you follow the movements with suppressed irritation, as those pale members do their best to uncork a medicine bottle, to snuff a candle, to pour out physic, or to touch you in a squeamish sort of way. If you are an impatient, hasty sort of man, and beg of her to leave the room, you will hear by the vexed, distressed sounds which come from her that she is humbly sobbing and weeping behind the door, and whispering foolishness of some kind to the servant. Finally, if you do not die, your loving wife, who has not slept during the whole 3 weeks of your illness, a fact of which she will constantly remind you, will fall ill in her turn, waste away, suffer much, and become even more incapable of any useful pursuit than she was before, while by the time that you have regained your normal state of health, she will express to you her self-sacrificing affection only by shedding around you a kind of benignant dullness which involuntarily communicates itself both to yourself and to every one else in your vicinity. The third kind of love, practical love, consists of a yearning to satisfy every need, every desire, every caprice, nay, every vice of the being beloved. People who love thus always love their life long, since the more they love, the more they get to know the object beloved, and the easier they find the task of loving it, that is to say, of satisfying its desires. Their love seldom finds expression in words, but if it does so, it expresses itself neither with assurance nor beauty, but rather in a shamefaced, awkward manner, since most people of this kind invariably have misgivings that they are loving unworthily. People of this kind love even the faults of their adored one, for the reason that those faults afford them the power of constantly satisfying new desires. They look for their affection to be returned, and even deceive themselves into believing that it is returned, and are happy accordingly. Yet, in the reverse case, they will still continue to desire happiness for their beloved one, and try by every means in their power, whether moral or material, great or small, to provide it. Such practical love it was, love for her nephew, for her niece, for her sister, for Lubov Sergievna, and even for myself, because I loved Dimitri, that shone in the eyes, as well as in the every word and movement, of Sophia Ivanovna. Only long afterwards did I learn to value her at her true worth. Yet even now the question occurred to me, what has made Dimitri, who throughout has tried to understand love differently to other young fellows, and has always had before his eyes the gentle, loving Sophia Ivanovna, suddenly fall so deeply in love with the incomprehensible Lubov Sergievna, and declare that in his aunt he can only find good qualities? Verily, it is a true saying that a prophet hath no honour in his own country. One of two things: either every man has in him more of bad than of good, or every man is more receptive to bad than to good. Lubov Sergievna he has not known for long, whereas his aunt's love he has known since the day of his birth. End of section 6. Recording by Bill Borst.